Section 17 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ann Boulais. Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland. Isabella of France, Chapter 2, Part 3. On the night of the 22nd of September, 1327, exactly a twelvemonth after the return of the Queen to England, the murder of her unfortunate husband was perpetrated with circumstances of the greatest horror. No outward marks of violence were perceptible on his person when the body was exposed to public view in Gloucester Cathedral, but the rigid and distorted lines of the face bore evidence of the agonies he had undergone, and it is reported that his cries had been heard at a considerable distance from the castle, where this barbarous regicide was committed. Many a one woke, adds the narrator, and prayed to God for the harmless soul which that night was departing in torture. The public indignation in that part of the country was so greatly excited against the infamous instruments of the Queen and Mortimer, that they were fain to make their escape beyond seas, to avoid the vengeance of the people. The murdered king was interred, without funeral pomp, in Gloucester Cathedral, and Isabella endeavoured, by the marriage festivities of her son and his young queen, to dissipate the general gloom which the suspicious circumstances attending the death of her unhappy consort had occasioned. But so universal was the feeling of disgust which the conduct of the Queen and her favourite Mortimer excited, that nothing but the despotism she had succeeded in establishing enabled her to keep possession of her usurped power. The pacification with Scotland gave great offence to the public, because Isabella bartered for £20,000 the claims of the King of England over Scotland, and Mortimer appropriated the money to his own use. By the same treaty, they restored the regalia of Scotland to their rightful owners. The English were indignant that in this regalia was comprised the famous Black Cross of St. Margaret, which had been one of the crown jewels of their Anglo-Saxon kings. Still more were they enraged that, without sanction of Parliament, the Queen concluded a marriage between the Princess Joanna, an infant 5 years old, and David Bruce, the heir of Scotland, who was about 2 years older. She accompanied her young daughter to Berwick, attended by Mortimer, and, in their presence, the royal children were married at that town, July 12, 1328. It was observed that the two brothers of the late king, Thomas of Brotherton and Edmund, Earl of Kent, and Isabella's own uncle, the Earl of Lancaster, with some other magnates, had withdrawn themselves from the National Council, in utter indignation at the late proceedings of the Queen and the insolence of her favourite Mortimer. They perceived, too late, that they had been made the tools of an artful, ambitious, and vindictive woman, who, under the pretence of reforming the abuses of her husband's government, had usurped the sovereign authority, and in 1 year committed more crimes than the late king and his unpopular ministers together had perpetrated during the 20 years of his reign. Moreover, the barbarous persecutions and cruel death of their late sovereign made the princes recoil with horror at the idea of their having been, in some measure, accomplices in the guilt of the Queen. Mortimer had even had the audacity, when Parliament met at Salisbury, October 16, to enter the town at the head of an army, and, bursting into the room where the prelates were assembled, forbade them, under peril of life and limb, to oppose his interests. He then seized on the young king and queen, and carried them off to Winchester. And, far from paying any regard to the Earl of Lancaster's complaints of the infringement of his office of guardian of the king's person, he marched to Leicester and plundered his domain there. Isabella's cruelty, her hypocrisy, and the unnatural manner in which she rendered the interests of the young king, her son, subservient to the aggrandizement of her ferocious paramour, Mortimer, excited the indignation of all classes, and a strong party was organized, under the auspices of the Plantagenet princes, for the delivering of the nation from the tyranny of this modern Semiramis. The Earl of Lancaster, who was by this time fully aware of the disposition of his vindictive kinswoman, perceived that he was intended for her next victim, on which he, with the brothers of the late king and their confederates, took up arms and put forth a manifesto containing 8 articles, all alarming to the guilty queen and Mortimer, especially the first clause, which threatened inquiry into the unlawful augmentations of her dower, and the 5th regarding the late king's death. The queen mother, aware of the impossibility of meeting such inquiries before Parliament, urged the young king to attack the malcontents, assuring him that the object of his uncle was to deprive him of the throne. The interference of the Archbishop of Canterbury prevented another civil war, and through his exertions a hollow pacification was effected between Isabella and the princes. It was not, however, in the nature of this princess to forgive any offence that had ever been offered to her, and it is to be observed that her enmity had hitherto always proved fatal to every person who had been so unfortunate as to incur her ill will. With the wariness of a cat, she now examined the characteristic qualities of the members of the royal family, whom she determined to attack separately, since she had found them too strong to engage collectively. She commenced with the Earl of Kent, who had, ever since the death of the king, his brother, suffered the greatest remorse for the part he had taken in the late revolution. Isabella, being aware of his state of mind, caused it to be insinuated to him that the late sovereign, his brother, was not dead, but a prisoner within the walls of Corfe Castle. A friar, whom the earl employed to inquire into the truth of this tale, on finding that everyone in that neighbourhood confidently believed that the unfortunate Edward II was living, under very close restraint, in the castle, endeavoured to obtain access to this mysterious captive. He was shown, at a distance, a person sitting at table, whose air and figure greatly resembled that of the deceased king, whom, indeed, he was meant to personate. The Earl of Kent, anxious to make reparation to his royal brother for the injuries he had done him, hastened to Corfe Castle, and boldly demanded of the governor to be conducted to the apartment of Sir Edward of Caernarvon, his brother. The governor did not deny that King Edward was in the castle, but protested the impossibility of permitting any one to see him. The earl then prevailed on him to take charge of a letter for his illustrious prisoner. This letter was immediately conveyed to Queen Isabella, and used by her as a pretence for the arrest of the deluded prince. This was done at Winchester, where the Parliament was then assembled. Earl Edmund was impeached of high treason before the peers. His own letter was the chief evidence produced against him, together with his confession, in which he acknowledged that a certain friar preacher of London told him he had conjured up a spirit, who assured him that his brother Edward was still alive. Also that Sir Ingram Berenger brought him a letter from the Lord Zouchet, requesting his assistance in the restoration of his late sovereign. For this impossible treason he was sentenced to lose his head. His arraignment took place on Sunday, March 13, 1329, Isabella's Sundays being no holidays, and he was condemned to die on the morrow. All that day, says the chroniclers, the king was so beset by the queen his mother and the Earl of March that it was impossible for him to make any efforts to preserve his uncle from the cruel fate to which he had been so unjustly doomed. This murder, which was designed by Isabella as an intimidation to the princes of the blood royal, had the effect of increasing the abhorrence in which she was now held throughout the kingdom. The queen presented Mortimer's son, Geoffrey, grants of the principal part of the estates of the princely victim. The death of Charles le Bel, without male issue, having left Isabella the sole surviving child of Philip le Bel, her eldest son, Edward III, considered that he had the best claim to the sovereignty of France. The 12 peers of France decided otherwise, and gave, first the regency, and then, on the birth of the posthumous daughter of Charles le Bel, the throne to Philip of Valois, the cousin of their late king. Edward was eager to assert his claim as the nephew of that monarch and the grandson of Philip le Bel, but his mother, deceived by overtures from France for a double marriage between her daughter Eleanor and the heir of Valois, and her second son and Philip's daughter, not only prevented him from asserting his own claims, but compelled him, sorely against his will, to acknowledge those of his rival, by performing homage for the provinces held of the French crown. Edward returned from his last conference with King Philip at Amiens, out of humour with himself, and still more so with his mother. The evil odour in which Isabella's reputation was generally held, both at home and abroad, though perhaps concealed from him in his own court, where he was as yet but a state puppet, surrounded by her creatures, was conveyed to him through a variety of channels, as soon as he was beyond the limits of her usurped authority. The pride, the cruelty, and insolence of Mortimer were represented to the king by his faithful friends, with other circumstances tending to convince him of the infamy of the queen mother's connection with that favourite. Edward was sensibly touched when informed of these things, and determined no longer to be a quiescent witness of his mother's dishonour. The parliament was summoned to meet at Nottingham a fortnight after Michaelmas, and the youthful sovereign considered that it would be a favourable time for the arrest of his mother's paramour, when all the barons of England were assembled round him in support of his royal authority. Edward had intended to take up his abode at Nottingham Castle, one of his own royal palaces, but Isabella, forestalling his design, had already established herself there, with Mortimer and his strong guard of armed followers. Isabella had used the precaution of ordering the keys of the castle to be brought to her, and at night, for greater security, she placed them under her pillow. The particulars of this most interesting crisis are best related in the words of the lively chronicler, from whom Stowe has taken his graphic narrative of the arrest of the queen and her lover. There was a parliament, where Roger Mortimer was in such glory and honour that it was without all comparison. No man durst name him other than the Earl of March, and a greater rout of men waited at his heels than on the king's person. He would suffer the king to rise to him, and would walk with him equally, step by step, and cheek by cheek, never preferring the king, but would go foremost himself with his officers. He greatly rebuked the Earl of Lancaster, cousin to the king, for that without his consent he appointed certain noblemen to lodgings in the town, asking, "Who made him so bold to take up his lodgings close to the queen?" With which words, the constable, being greatly feared, alarmed, appointed lodgings for the Earl of Lancaster a full mile out of the town, where was lodged John Bohun, the Earl of Hereford, Lord High Constable of England. By which means a great contention arose among the noblemen and the common people, who called Roger Mortimer the queen's paragon and the king's master, who destroys the king's blood and usurps the regal majesty. All this troubled the king's friends, and William Montague, and others, drew to them Robert de Holland, keeper of Nottingham Castle, unto whom all secret corners of the same were known. Then, on a certain night, the king lying without the castle, both he and his friends were brought, by torchlight, through a secret way underground, beginning far from the castle, till they came even to the queen's chamber, which they by chance found open. They, being armed with naked swords in their hands, went forwards, leaving the king armed without the chamber door, lest his mother should espy him. They entered in, slew Sir Hugh Turpington, who resisted them, and to John Neville they gave a deadly wound. From thence they went to the queen mother, whom they found with the Earl of March, just ready to go to bed. And, having seized the said earl, they led him into the hall, the queen following, crying out, "Belle Fils! Eyes petit gentle Mortimer," for she knew her son was there, though she saw him not. She likewise entreated Montague and his people to do no harm to the person of Mortimer, because he was a worthy knight, her dear friend, and well-beloved cousin. No reply was made to her intercession, and Mortimer was hurried away, the castle locked on the queen, and all her effects sealed up. The next morning Roger Mortimer and his friends were led prisoners towards London. As soon as they appeared, the populace of Nottingham and the nobles of the king's party set up a tremendous shout. the Earl of Lancaster, who was at that time blind, joining in the outcry, and making violent gesticulations for joy. On his arrival in London, Mortimer was for a few hours committed to the Tower, previous to his summary execution. Froissart, after relating very briefly the execution of the Earl of Kent, which he attributes to the Queen Mother and Mortimer, proceeds to say, "Not long after, great infamy fell upon the Queen Mother. Whether with just cause or not, I am ignorant, but in this the Lord Mortimer was inculpated. The king then ordered him to be arrested and brought to London, and before him and a very great number of the barons and nobles of the realm, a knight, by the king's command, recited the deeds of the Lord Mortimer, from a declaration he held in his hand. Every one was then asked, by way of counsel, what sentence should be given. Judgment was soon given, for each had perfect knowledge of the facts, from good report and information. They replied to the king's question, that he ought to suffer the same death as Sir Hugh Despencer the younger, which sentence had neither delay nor mercy. This was instantly carried into effect, without waiting to hear what the accused had to say in his own vindication. Sir Simon Burford and John Deverell, who were taken in the queen's antechamber at Nottingham Castle, earnestly desired to disclose the particulars of Edward II's murder, but were not permitted to disburden their consciences of their guilty knowledge, lest they should too deeply implicate the Queen Mother. Mortimer was the first person executed at Tyburn, which was then known by the name of Elms. Burford and Deverell were executed with him. His body hung on the gallows at Tyburn 2 days and nights, by the especial order of the king. It was then taken down and buried in the Greyfriars Church, within Newgate, of which Queen Isabella was a benefactress. Isabella was spared the ignominy of a public trial through the intercession of the Pope, John XXII, who wrote to the young king, exhorting him not to expose his mother's shame. After this, Edward attributed all her crimes to the evil influence of Mortimer, as may be seen in the royal declaration to Parliament of the reasons which induced him to inflict the punishment of death on that great state criminal. In the 9th article of this posthumous arraignment it is set forth that the said Roger falsely and maliciously sowed discord between the father of our lord the king and the queen his companion, making her believe that if she came near her husband, he would poignard her or murder her in some other manner. Wherefore, by this cause, and by other subtleties, the said queen remained absent from her said lord, to the great dishonour of the king and of the said queen his mother, and great damage, perhaps, of the whole nation hereafter, which God avert." One of the first acts of the emancipated monarch, after the gallant achievement by which he had rendered himself master of his own realm, was to strip the queen mother of the unconscionable dower to which she had helped herself, and to reduce her income to £1,000 a year. It was also judged expedient by his council to confine her to one of the royal fortresses at some distance from the metropolis, lest by her intriguing disposition she should excite fresh troubles in the realm. Froissart, after relating the particulars of Mortimer's death, adds, "The king soon after, by the advice of his council, ordered his mother to be confined in a goodly castle, and gave her plenty of ladies to wait upon her, as well as knights and squires of honour. He made her a handsome allowance to keep and maintain the state to which she had been accustomed, but forbade her ever to go out or show herself abroad, except at certain times, and when any shows were exhibited in the court of the castle." Castle Rising, in Norfolk, was the place where Queen Isabella was destined to spend the long years of her widowhood. It had belonged to the Albinis, from whom it passed to the lords of Montalt. The widow of the last baron of that line had surrendered it to Queen Isabella, during her regency, for an annuity of £400 per annum. It was a noble pile, built in 1176 by William Albini, husband to Queen Adelicia. It was constructed in the manner of Norwich Castle, on a bold eminence surrounded by a high bank and deep vallum. The walls were 3 yards thick. The keep was a large square tower, encompassed with a deep ditch and bold rampart, on which was a strong wall with 3 towers. Enough remains to show that Castle Rising must have been a most formidable, if not impregnable fortress. Froissart says, "The queen passed her time there meekly," by which our readers are to understand that she neither devised plots nor treasons against the government of her illustrious son, Edward III., and gave no further cause for public scandal. More than one ancient historian hints that, during her long confinement, Isabella was afflicted with occasional fits of derangement. It is asserted that these aberrations commenced in a violent access of madness, which seized her while the body of Mortimer hung on the gallows. Her agonies were so severe, that, among the common people, the report prevailed for some months that she died, at the time the body was taken down. These traditions led us to conclude that for many months the populace did not know what had become of her. Her retired life, unconnected with conventual vows, must have strengthened the reports of her derangement, which was attributed to the horrors of conscience. She was in her 36th year when her seclusion at Castle Rising commenced. The king her son generally, when in England, visited her twice or thrice a year, and never permitted any one to name her in his presence other than with the greatest respect. It is to be observed that Edward's counsel, in regard to the petitions of certain individuals for the recovery of money due to them during her government, are by him referred to the advice of Queen Isabella. Her name is carefully guarded from all reproach in the rolls of Parliament, which nevertheless abound in disputes relative to her regency. There is one petition from the poor lieges of the forest of Macclesfield to King Edward, declaring that Madam his mother holds the forest as her heritage, and yet the bailiff of Macclesfield kills her venison and destroys her wood. Isabella is not named as queen, but only as Madame the king's mother. The king replies, "Let this petition be shown to the queen, that her advice may be learned thereon." During the first 2 years of Isabella's residence at Castle Rising, her seclusion appears most rigorous, but, in 1332, from various notations, the fact may be gathered that her condition was ameliorated. That year King Edward declared that, as his dearest mother had simply and spontaneously surrendered her dower into his hands, he has assigned her divers other castles and lands to the amount of 20,000 pounds. The same year this dower was settled, she was permitted to make a pilgrimage to Lady Shrine of Walsingham, not far from her residence in Norfolk. This is evidenced from the ancient Latin records of the corporation of Lynn, which is in the neighbourhood of Castle Rising. There is an entry of 20 shillings for bread sent to Isabella, Queen Dowager, when she came from Walsingham. Also 4 pounds for a cask of wine, 3 pounds, 18 shillings 6 pence, for a piece of wax, and 2 pounds for barley. Also 3 shillings for the carriage of these purchases. King Edward restored to his mother, 2 years afterwards, the revenues of Ponthieu and Montreuil, which were originally the gift of her murdered lord. The same year, 1334, her son, John of Eltham, died in the bloom of life, and her daughter Eleanor was married to the Duke of Gueldres. Edward III likewise visited his mother at Risings. The records of Lynn return this notice, dated 1334. The Queen Isabella sent her precept to the mayor to provide her 8 carpenters, to make preparations for the king's visit. In 1337, Edward III again made some stay at Castle Rising with his mother, and Adam de Riffham of Lynn sent him a present of wine on this occasion. Once only we have evidence that Isabella visited the metropolis. This was in the 12th year of her son's reign, when she is witness to the delivery of the Great Seal in its purse by King Edward to Robert de Burghurst in the grand chamber of the Bishop of Winchester's palace in Southwark. Parliament granted to Edward III an aid of 30,000 sacks of wool, and by writ, dated February 27, 1343, the barons of the exchequer were forbidden to levy any part from the lands and manors of the queen mother, because it was unreasonable that a person exempt and not summoned to Parliament should be burthened with aids granted by Parliament. The same year Isabella received another visit from the king her son. On this occasion the Lynn records note that 11 pounds 13 shillings 10 pence was expended for meat sent to Our Lady Queen Isabella. There is an item for £4 16 shillings 1 pence, paid by the corporation, for a present sent to the household of our lord the king, at Thorndines, at his first coming to Rising, and 3 pence for a horse sent by a messenger to Rising. The corporation is also answerable for 12 pence, given to William of Lakenham, the falcon bearer, at Risings. 4 shillings 3 pence given to the messengers and minstrels of Queen Isabella, 2 shillings 8 pence for wine sent to the queen's maid, and 12 pence, a largest for the Earl of Suffolk's minstrels. Barreled sturgeon was a favourite food at the queen's table, and it was certainly very costly, when compared with the price of other viands. The corporation of Lynn the same year sent gifts of a pipe of wine and a barrel of sturgeon, costing together £9 12 shillings 9 pence, to their lady Queen Isabella, and moreover paid John the butcher money for conveying the said gifts to Castle Rising. They sent to her treasurer and seneschal gifts of wine that cost 40 pence, and presented 12 shillings to John de Windsor and other men of the king's family, when at Rising, besides 2 pence given to a servant looking for stray horses from the castle. Likewise 40 pence given to the steward of Rising when he came to obtain horses, for use of King Edward. A barrel of sturgeon cost as much as £2 15 shillings. The men of Lynn note that they paid £11 for 4 barrels sent at different times as gifts to the queen at Castle Rising, and 20 shillings for 2 quarter barrels of sturgeon sent by her servant Perrot. The supply of herrings as gifts from the men of Lynn amounted to £6, and they sent her 103 quarters of wax at a cost of £4 16 shillings 1 pence. In the 18th year of his reign, King Edward dates several letters to the Pope from Castle Rising. A curious plan for annoyance of King Edward was devised in the year 1348 by the French monarch, who proposes to make the Queen Dowager of France and Isabella the mediatrices of a peace. They were to meet between Calais and Boulogne. But Edward was too wise to fall into the snare of attracting public attention to the guilty and degraded mother, from whom his claims to the throne of France were derived. Isabella was not suffered to take any part in the negotiation. The succeeding documents prove that the treaty was completed by the Duke of Lancaster and the Count of Eu. In the 31st year of his reign, King Edward granted safe conduct to William de Lath to wait on Queen Isabella at her castle of Rising, he coming from Scotland, probably with news from her daughter, Queen Joanna, who was then very sick. This person was physician to the Queen of Scotland. The next year Isabella died at Castle Rising, August 22nd, 1358, aged 63. She chose the church of Grey Friars, where the mangled remains of her paramour, Mortimer, had been buried, 28 years previously, for the place of her interment. And, carrying her characteristic hypocrisy even to the grave, she was buried with the heart of her murdered husband on her breast. King Edward gave his mother a pompous funeral, and issued a precept to the sheriffs of London and Middlesex, November 20th, to cleanse the streets from dirt and all impurities, and to gravel Bishopsgate Street and Aldgate, against the coming of the body of his dearest mother, Queen Isabella, and directs the officers of his exchequer to distribute £9 for that purpose. Isabella was interred in the choir of the Grey Friars, within Newgate, and had a fine alabaster tomb erected to her memory. She had given £62 towards the building of this church. It was usual for persons buried in the Grey Friars to be wrapped in the garment of the order, as a security against the attacks of the foul fiend. Queen Isabella was buried in that garment, and few stood in more need of such protection. According to Bloomfield, local tradition asserts that Queen Isabella lies buried in Castle Rising Church, and that all the procession to the Grey Friars in London was but an empty pageant. In confirmation of this assertion, they point out a simple grey stone, with its inscription deeply cut, Isabella Regina. Antiquaries, however, are of opinion that this stone covers the grave of one of the officers, or ladies, who died in her service at Castle Rising. But it is also possible that she might have bequeathed her heart to her parish church, and that this inscription may denote the spot where it was interred. An effigy of Isabella is to be seen, in the most exquisite preservation, among the figures which adorn the tomb of her son, John of Eltham, at Westminster Abbey. It is the third from the right, when the examiner stands with his back to St. Edward's Chapel. The workmanship of this, and the other statues of John of Eltham's kindred, is of the most delicate kind. The easiness of the attitudes, united with minute attention to details, denote an artist of superior genius. The effigies are all cast in bronze, and the row opposite to St. Edward's Chapel are so well secured from the mischievous assaults of abbey depredators by the grille of thick iron which parts the tomb from the passage, that they are in the same state as when they came from the hands of the artist. First stands the mother of Isabella, the Queen of France and Navarre. She exactly resembles her portrait engraved in Mount Faucon. Then stands the effigy of Isabella's father, Philip le Bel. Next is given Isabella herself. Her head is remarkably broad and low, and she has considerable breadth over the cheek bones. She is very like her mother, but her features are pretty, with a laughing expression. The effigy is identified as hers by the garb of royal widowhood. She wears a crown on the top of her hood. Her veil hangs on each side of her face. The widow's barb appears half covering her chin, and a scepter is in her hand. Such was certainly her dress at Castle Rising at the death of her son, Prince John, in 1334, and such must have been her costume during the remainder of her life, since widows in those times wore the dress of mourning all their lives, unless they found second husbands. The effigy of her murdered lord, Edward II., stands next hers. It is extremely like that on his tomb at Gloucester. Isabella's virtuous daughter, Joanna, Queen of Scotland, the faithful and devoted consort of the unfortunate David Bruce, survived her mother only a few days, and was interred in the castle of the Greyfriars within Newgate. Some authors assert that, on the same day, London witnessed the solemn pageant of the entrance of the funeral procession of the two queens, one from the eastern and the other from the northern road, and that, entering the church by opposite doors, the royal biers met at the high altar. After a separation of 30 years, the evil mother and the holy daughter were united in the same burial rite. End of section 17. Section 18 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ann Boulais. Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland. Philippa of Hainault, Chapter 1, Part 1. The happy union of the illustrious Philippa with her thrice-renowned lord had been previously cemented by mutual preference, manifested in the first sweet springtime of existence, when Prince Edward took refuge with his mother, Queen Isabella, at the court of Hainault. Count William of Hainault had, at that time, 4 daughters, says Froissart. These were Margaret, Philippa, Joanna, and Isabel. The young prince, during his mother's residence in Hainault, paid more court and attention to Philippa than any of the others. The young lady also conversed with him more frequently, and sought his company oftener than any of her sisters. This was in 1326, when Prince Edward was in his 15th year, and the lady Philippa a few months younger. She possessed some Flemish beauty, being tall in stature, and adorned with the brilliant complexion for which the women of that country are celebrated. The poet of her time has commemorated her roseate hue and beauty bright, and we can well imagine, though Philippa's matron charms became a little too exuberant in after life, that as a sweet-tempered Flemish girl in her 15th year, her early bloom was very lovely. The youthful lovers, after residing together in the palace of the Count of Hainault at Valenciennes for about a fortnight, were separated. Edward embarked with his mother and John of Hainault on the dangerous expedition of invading his unfortunate father's kingdom, while his beloved was left in a state of uncertainty whether the exigencies of the state and the caprice of relatives would ultimately permit to be joined the hands of those whose hearts had already elected each other. Although a decided affection subsisted between young Edward and Philippa, it was not considered in accordance with the royal etiquette of that era for the heir of England to acknowledge that he had disposed of his heart without the consent of his parliament and council. Queen Isabella undertook the arrangement of this affair, and soon led the public authorities to the decision that a daughter of the Count of Hainault would be the most desirable alliance for her son. But, even as late as the 5th of August, 1327, the particular daughter of that family was not pointed out in the document requesting the dispensation of the Pope. The words are, to marry a daughter of that nobleman, William, Count of Hainault, Holland and Zealand, and Lord of Friesland. But the name of Philippa was not once mentioned throughout the letter. Thus the lovers remained 7 months after the coronation of Edward in a state of suspense. The council at last gravely decided that Adam Orleton, the notorious bishop of Hereford, should visit the court of Hainault, and choose, among the daughters of the count, the young lady who seemed most worthy to be the queen of England. As the choice of the bishop and king fell on Philippa, the young king had certainly informed Adam Orleton, in confidence, which princess among the fair sisterhood was the elected lady of his heart. The proceedings of the bishop were thus narrated by our last rhyming chronicler, Harding. He sent forth then to Hainault for a wife, a bishop and other lords temporal. Among themselves our lords, for high prudence, of the bishop asked counsel and sentence. Which daughter of the 5 should be our queen? Who counselled thus with sad advisement, we will have her with fairest form, I ween. To which they all accorded with one mind, and chose Philippa that was full feminine, as the wise bishop did determine. But then among themselves they laughed aye. Those lords then said, their bishop judged full sooth the beauty of a lady. Shortly after the young King Edward completed his 16th year, says Froissart, his council sent a bishop, 2 knights baronets, and 2 able clerks to Sir John of Hainault, to beg of him to assist the young King of England in his suit to one of his nieces, since the young king would love her more dearly than any other lady. On his account, Sir John feasted and paid many honours to these messengers. He took them to Valenciennes, where his brother the Count of Hainault gave them such sumptuous entertainments as would be tiresome to relate. He most willingly complied with their requests, if the Pope and Holy Church had no objection. 2 of the knights and some able clerks were dispatched to Avignon, for without the Pope's dispensation it could not be done, on account of their near relationship, for their 2 mothers were cousins german. As soon as they came to Avignon, the Pope and college consented most benignantly. On their return to Valenciennes, immediate preparations were made for the dress and equipage of a lady who was considered worthy to be the Queen of England. The king, then at Nottingham, empowered the Bishop of Lichfield and Coventry on the 8th of October, 1327, to conclude his marriage with a noble damsel, Philippa of Hainault. He likewise charges his beloved Bartholomew de Burghurst, constable of Dover, to receive and welcome into his kingdom that noble person, William Count of Hainault, with the illustrious damsel Philippa, his daughter, and the familiars of the said count and damsel. And he charges all and singular his nobility and people of the counties through which the count, damsel, and familiars may pass, to do them honour and give them needful aid. It was necessary for the Lady Philippa and her escort to travel across England to meet the royal bridegroom, who was then performing his warlike novitiate on the Scottish border, under the auspices of his mother and Mortimer, against the great Robert Bruce. Philippa was married at Valenciennes by procuration, soon after the date of this instrument. She embarked for England at Wisen, landed at Dover with all her suite, and arrived in London December 23, 1327, with the retinue and display of magnificence in accordance with the great wealth of her country. She was escorted by her uncle, John of Hainault, and not by her father, as was expected. A solemn procession of the clergy introduced her into the city, and she was presented by the Lord Mayor and Aldermen of London with a service of plate worth £300 as a marriage gift, a benefaction prompted most likely by the gratitude of the citizens for a treaty of commerce established between England and the Low Countries in the preceding summer, when these nuptials were first publicly agitated. The king was still with his army in the north, York being his headquarters, and though London was in an uproarious state of rejoicing at her arrival, the royal bride left it immediately to meet her lord. But there were feastings and sumptuous entertainments in London for 3 weeks after her landing. The hands of Edward and Philippa were united at York, January 24, 1328. The magnificence of the espousals was heightened by the grand entry of 100 of the principal nobility of Scotland, who had arrived in order to conclude a lasting peace with England, cemented by the marriage of the king's little sister Joanna. The Parliament and Royal Council were likewise convened at York, and the flower of the English nobility, then in arms, were assembled round the young king and his bride. The royal pair kept Easter at York, and after the final peace with Scotland, they returned southward from Lincoln to Northampton, and finally settled in June at the beautiful summer palace of Woodstock, which seems the principal abiding place of Philippa, while her young husband was yet under the tutelage of Mortimer and the queen mother. A dead silence is kept in all the public documents regarding the amount of Philippa's portion, for reasons good, since the queen mother had already spent it. As for the usual dower of the queens of England, the whole of its lands were possessed by the queen mother, but by a deed executed at Northampton, May 5th, the king, says the venerable father, Roger, Bishop of Lichfield and Coventry, had promised that £15,000 per annum of lands should be settled on her. Isabella provided so well for herself and her daughter-in-law that she left her son, the sovereign of England, nearly penniless. After assisting at the marriage of his niece, Sir John of Hainault returned to his native country, laden with jewels and rich presents. Few of the Hainaulters who had escorted her to England stayed with Queen Philippa, but among those who remained was a youth named Sir Wantelet de Mauny, whose office was to carve for her. The coronation of the young queen did not take place till more than 2 years after her marriage. The king, from his palace at Eltham, issued a summons, dated the 28th of February, 1330, for his beloved and faithful Bartholomew de Burghurst to appear with his barons of the Cinque Ports to do their customary duties at the coronation of his dearest queen, Philippa, which takes place, if God be propitious, the Sunday next to the feast of St. Peter, in the Cathedral of Westminster. It took place on that day with no particular splendour, for the rapacity of Isabella and Mortimer had absorbed all the funds provided to support the dignity of the crown. But the period of their sway drew near its close. The young lion of England had already manifested signs of disdain at the ignoble restraint in which he was held. Parliament was summoned that spring at Woodstock, whither Philippa and her royal lord had retired after the coronation. A singular document is dated from thence, the succeeding April, in which the king informs his treasurer that his faithful and beloved Robert de Vere, being Earl of Oxford, was hereditary chamberlain to the queens of England. At all coronations the ancestors of the earl had officiated in the same capacity, and that in consequence he claimed the bed in which the queen had slept, her shoes, and 3 silver basins, one in which she washed her head, and 2 others in which she washed her hands. The king desires that the earl may freely receive the basins and the shoes, but as for the bed, the treasurer is to pay the earl chamberlain 100 marks as a compensation for his claim thereon. While the young king was yet under the dominion of his unworthy mother, his consort Philippa gave birth to their firstborn, afterwards the celebrated hero Edward, surnamed the Black Prince. He first saw the light at the Palace of Woodstock, June 15, 1330. The great beauty of this infant, his size, and the firm texture of his limbs, filled everyone with admiration who saw him. Like that renowned queen regent of France, Blanche of Castile, mother of St. Louis, Philippa chose to nourish her babe at her own bosom. It is well known that the portraits of the young Philippa and her princely boy form the favourite models for the Virgin child at that era. In order to celebrate the birth of the heir of England, a grand tournament was proclaimed at London. Philippa and all the female nobility were invited to be present. 13 knights were engaged on each side, and the tournament was held in Cheapside, between Wood Street and Queen Street. The highway was covered with sand to prevent the horses' feet from slipping, and a grand temporary tower was erected, made of boarding, filled with seats for the accommodation of the queen and her ladies. But scarcely had this fair company entered the tower, when the scaffolding suddenly gave way, and all present fell to the ground with the queen. Though no one was injured, all were terribly frightened, and great confusion ensued. When the young king saw the peril of his wife, he flew into a tempest of rage, and vowed that the careless carpenters, who had constructed the building, should instantly be put to death. Whether he would thus far have stretched the prerogative of an English sovereign can never be known, for his angelic partner, scarcely recovered from the terror of her fall, threw herself on her knees before the incensed king, and so effectually pleaded for the pardon of the poor men, that Edward became pacified and forgave them. In the decline of the year 1330, Edward III shook off the restraints imposed upon him by his unworthy mother and her ferocious paramour. He executed justice on the great criminal Mortimer, in the summary and hasty way in which he was always inclined to act, when under the impulse of passion, and at a distance from his queen. No one can wonder that he was impatient to destroy the murderer of his father and of his uncle. Still, this eagerness to execute sudden vengeance under the influence of rage, whether justly or unjustly excited, is a trait in the character of this mighty sovereign which appears in his youth, and which it is necessary to point out in order to develop the beautiful and nearly perfect character of his queen. No sooner were the reins of government in the hands of the young king than he vigorously exerted himself for the reformation of the abuses, for which the administration of Mortimer was infamous. Many excellent laws were made and others revived, to the great satisfaction of the English people. But above all things, the king had the wisdom to provide a profitable occupation for the active energies of his people. Blessed be the memory of King Edward III and Philippa of Hainault, his queen, who first invented clothes, says a monastic chronicler. Start not, gentle reader. The English wore clothes before the time of this excellent queen. The grateful monk, by this invocation, merely means to imply that by her advice the English first manufactured cloth. Philippa, young as she was, well remembered the sources of prosperity which enriched her own country. She established a manufacturing colony at Norwich in the year 1335, but the first steps towards this good work were commenced so early as the 3rd of July 1331, within a few months of the assumption of power by the youthful king. A letter so dated, from Lincoln, is addressed to John Kemp of Flanders, a cloth weaver in wool, in which he is informed that if he will come to England with the servants and apprentices of his mystery, and with his goods and chattels, and with any dyers and fullers who may be inclined willingly to accompany him beyond seas, and exercise their mysteries in the kingdom of England, they shall have letters of protection and assistance in their settlement. Philippa occasionally visited Kemp and the rest of her colony in Norwich. Nor did she disdain to blend all the magnificence of chivalry with her patronage of the productive arts. Like a beneficent queen of the hive, she cherished and protected the working bees. At a period of her life, which in common characters is considered girlhood, she had enriched one of the cities of her realm by her statistical wisdom. There was wisdom likewise in the grand tournaments she held at Norwich, which might be considered as exhibitions showing the citizens how well, in time of need, they could be protected by a gallant nobility. These festivals displayed the defensive class and the productive class in admirable union and beneficial intercourse, while the example of the queen promoted mutual respect between them. Edward III did not often take part in these visits to Norwich, which were generally paid by the queen while her husband spent some days with his guilty and miserable mother in Castle Rising in Norfolk, a strong proof that he did not consider Isabella a fit companion for his Philippa. It is likely that the establishment of the Flemish artists in England had some connection with the visit that Jeanne of Valois, Countess of Hainault, paid to her royal daughter in the autumn of 1331. The mother of Philippa was a wise and good woman, who loved peace and promoted the peaceful arts. During her sojourn in England, she further strengthened the beneficial alliance between England and the Low Countries by negotiating a marriage between the king's sister, Eleanora, and the Duke of Gueldres, which was soon after celebrated. End of section 18. Section 19 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ann Boulais. Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland. Philippa of Hainault, Chapter 1, Part 2. Edward III commenced a furious war on Scotland in 1333. His faithful queen followed his campaign, but while the king laid siege to Berwick, Philippa was in some danger at Bamborough Castle, where she resided that summer. For Douglas, the valiant guardian of his young king, turned the tables on the English invader, and made a forced march to lay fierce siege to Bamborough, hoping that Edward, alarmed at the danger of his queen, would relinquish Berwick and fly to her assistance. But Edward knew too well the strength of King Ina's castle broad and high, and the firm mind of his Philippa, to swerve from his designs on Berwick. Yet the temper of Edward was certainly aggravated into ferociousness by the attempt to capture his queen, and he was led by sudden passion into the cruel murder of the two young Setons. These unfortunate youths were the sons of the governor of Berwick, either given by him as hostages to Edward III for the performance of certain terms of surrender, or, what was still worse, were prisoners put to death, because their father would not surrender his trust. Either way, the act was atrocious. Perhaps it would have been prevented if the just and gracious Philippa had been by the side of her incensed lord. But Philippa was closely besieged in Bamborough, and her danger exasperated her husband into an act really worse than any performed by his stern grandsire, Edward I. The king knew that Douglas was no trifler in any work he took in hand. He therefore resolved, by a desperate blow, to take Berwick, and march to relieve his queen from the attacks of the Scottish regent. He certainly gained Berwick from the stunned and paralyzed father, but by the murder of the hapless youths, he forever stained his chivalric name. Douglas and Edward joined battle, not far from Berwick, soon after, and the Scots were overpowered at the disastrous battle of Halidon Hill. Edward, with his queen, afterwards triumphantly entered Berwick, which has ever since remained annexed to the English crown. Edward and Philippa were in England during the winter of 1334. At the Palace of Woodstock, on February the 5th, the queen brought into the world Elisabeth, likewise called Isabella, the Princess Royal. The queen undertook another campaign in the succeeding spring. That year her father sent King Edward a present of a rich helmet, made of gold and set with precious stones, with a remonstrance against wasting his strength in Scotland, where there was no plunder to be got, when the same expense would prosecute his claims on France. The queen this winter became the mother of a second princess, named Joanna. Philippa followed her lord to a third northern campaign. Her second son, William of Hatfield, was born in a village in Yorkshire in the winter of 1336. This infant lived but a few weeks. In the absence of Edward, the Scotch war was prosecuted by his only brother, John, Earl of Cornwall, with great cruelty. This young prince died at Perth, October the 5th, of a wound which he got in his ferocious attack on Lesmahago. When Philippa resided in the north of England, A circumstance occurred which is an amusing instance of monastic etiquette. King Edward had returned from Scotland, and advanced as far as Durham, where he established his lodging in St. Cuthbert's Priory, near the castle. The queen travelled from York to meet and welcome him. She supped in the priory, and, thinking it was no offence, retired to pass the night in her husband's apartment. Scarcely had she undressed when the affrighted monks came to the door, and pathetically remonstrated against the infringement of the rules of their order, intimating that their holy patron St. Cuthbert, who during his life very sedulously eschewed the company of the fair sex, and would be direfully offended if one of them slept beneath the roof of his convent, however high her rank might be. The pious Philippa, distressed at the idea of unwittingly offending St. Cuthbert, immediately rose from the bed in haste, fled in her night-dress to the castle, which was fortunately close by, and passed the night there by herself. The gout and other maladies put an end to the existence of Count William of Hainault soon after he had formed a league against France with King Edward, and with the wealthy father of his queen, Edward lost the liberal supplies with which he carried on his warfare. The English people chose always to be at war, but they expected their monarchs to find the cost out of their private revenues and feudal dues, which were certainly not sufficient for the purpose. Edward was reduced to extreme poverty even in the commencement of his long war, and obliged to pawn his queen's crown at Cologne for £2,500 in the year 1339. Soon after, the English people submitted, not to a tax on wool, but a tax of wool, and subscribed 30,000 packs of that commodity, which, being sent down the Rhine to Cologne, redeemed Philippa's best crown from thraldom. During the whole of this reign, the crown jewels were seldom out of pawn, notwithstanding the wealth that the infant manufacture of cloth was already drawing to the coasts of England. The prosperity that the queen's colony of Flemish artists had brought to Norwich had been felt so early as 1336, when Philippa paid that city a visit, during her husband's progress to Castle Rising. She was received by the grateful citizens with all the honours due to a public benefactress. As vicar of the empire and head of the Confederate League of Germany, Edward III had his headquarters, during several of the Flemish campaigns, at Antwerp and Ghent, where his queen kept her court. At Antwerp, the third son of Philippa and Edward III was born, November 29th, 1338. This prince was a true Fleming, being born at Flanders of a Flemish mother. In due time Prince Lionel grew to be nearly 7 feet in height, and, being athletic in proportion, was a champion of whom any country might be proud. The queen returned, with this infant Hercules, to England in the autumn of 1339, and in the ensuing year King Edward paid a long visit to his unhappy mother in Norfolk, while Queen Philippa went to Norwich to visit her woolen manufactories. She found a vast number of the Norwich people, who, having been apprentices of Kemp and his followers, were establishing themselves in the profitable trades of weaving and dyeing. She was received with great joy, and favoured the citizens with her presence from February to Easter. At the festivities of that season her royal lord held a grand tournament at Norwich, where he tilted in person. In the spring of that same year Philippa again sailed for the opposite coast, and established her court at Ghent. King Edward, in the meantime, cruised between England and Holland, where he had a fleet of upwards of 300 ships. Philippa gave birth to her fourth son at Ghent, on the Midsummer's Day, 1340, at the very time that her warlike lord was fighting his grand naval battle off Blankenburg. Next day the king landed at Sluys, impatient to embrace his queen and her infant, and bring Philippa tidings of the greatest naval victory the English at that time had ever gained over France. Philippa's boy was John of Gaunt, afterwards so renowned as Duke of Lancaster. The interference of the mother of Philippa about this time occasioned a temporary cessation of hostilities between France and England. This princess, just as the belligerents were about to engage before Tournay, went to her son-in-law and then to her brother, King Philip, and, kneeling before them, implored them to make peace and stop the effusion of Christian blood. The pacification effected by the mother of Queen Philippa for a while put a stop to this kindred warfare. It was indeed time, for both the mighty Edward and his faithful queen were literally in a state of bankruptcy. She had given up her crown, and all the jewels she possessed, which her royal lord had pawned to the Flemish merchants, but his wants were still so great, that to raise a further sum, he likewise pawned the person of his valiant kinsman, the Earl of Derby, who actually gave himself up to personal restraint, while Edward stole away with his queen and the child she nourished to Zealand. Here he embarked with Philippa and the infant John of Gaunt, attended by few servants. The ship was small, the weather stormy, and the royal passengers were in frequent danger of losing their lives. However, at midnight, December 2nd, 1340, they landed safely on Tower Wharf. Here the king found that 3 nurses, and the rest of the royal children, constituted the sole garrison of his regal fortress of the Tower. The careless constable, Nicholas de la Boche, had decamped that evening to visit a lady love in the city, and his warders and soldiers, following so good an example, had actually left the Tower to take care of itself. The great Edward, who was not in the mildest of tempers, owing to the untoward state of his finances, took possession of the fortress of his capital in a towering rage. As his return was wholly unexpected, the consternation of Constable de la Boche may be supposed, when he had concluded his city visit. It was well for the careless castellan that the gentle Philippa was by the side of her incensed lord at this juncture. About this time the heart of the mighty Edward swerved for a while from its fidelity to Philippa, and had not the royal hero been enamoured of a lady of exemplary virtue, the peace of the queen might have been forever destroyed. Sir William Montacute had been rewarded for the good service he did the king in the beginning of his reign by the title of the Earl of Salisbury. He had married the fair Catherine de Grasson, and received the castellanship of Wark Castle, whither he had taken his countess, who lived in retirement away from the court. In the meantime, Salisbury had been captured in the French war. His castle in the north, which was defended by his countess and his nephew, was besieged in the Second Scottish War by King David. When in great danger, young Montacute, by a bold personal adventure, carried the news of the distress of the countess to King Edward, who was encamped near Berwick. At the approach of Edward, the King of Scots raised the siege of Wark. The royal hero's interview with Catherine the Fair follows in the words of Froissart. The moment the countess heard of the king's approach, she ordered all the gates to be thrown open, and went to meet him most richly dressed, insomuch that no one could look at her but with wonder and admiration at her noble deportment, great beauty, and affability of behaviour. When she came near King Edward, she made obeisance to the ground, and gave him thanks for coming to her assistance, and then conducted him into the castle, to entertain and honour him, as she was very capable of doing. Everyone was delighted with her, but the king could not take his eyes off from her, so that a spark of fine love struck upon his heart, which lasted a long time, for he did not believe that the whole world produced any other lady so worthy of being beloved. They entered the castle hand in hand. The countess led him first to the hall, and then to the best chamber, which was very richly furnished, as belonging to so fine a lady. King Edward kept his eyes so fixed upon the countess, that the gentle dame was quite abashed. After he had sufficiently examined his apartment, he retired to a window, and, leaning on it, fell into a profound reverie. The countess left him to order dinner to be made ready, and the table set, and the hall ornamented and set out, likewise to welcome the knights and lords who accompanied the king. When she had given all the orders to her servants she thought needful, she returned with a cheerful countenance to King Edward, and said, "Dear sir, what are you musing on? Such meditating is not proper for you, saving your grace. You ought rather to be in high spirits, for having freed England from her enemy without loss of blood." The king replied, "Oh, dear lady, you must know that, since I have been in this castle, some thoughts have oppressed my mind that I was not before aware of, so that it behoves me to reflect." Being uncertain what may be the event, I cannot withdraw my attention." "Dear sir," answered the lady, "you ought to be of good cheer, and feast with your friends, to give them more pleasure, and leave off pondering. For God has been very bountiful to you in your undertakings, so that you are the most feared and renowned prince in Christendom. If the king of Scotland had vexed you by the mischiefs he hath done in your kingdom, you will speedily be able to make reprisal in his dominions. Therefore come, if it please you, into the hall to your knights, for dinner will soon be served." "O sweet lady," said King Edward, "there be other things which touch my heart and lie heavy there than what you talk of. For in truth, your beauteous mien and the perfections of your face and behaviour have wholly overcome me, and so deeply impressed my heart, that my happiness wholly depends on meeting a return to my flame which no denial from you can ever extinguish." "O my dread lord," replied the countess, "do not amuse yourself by laughing at me with trying to tempt me, for I cannot believe you are in earnest as to what you have just said. Is it likely that so noble and gallant a prince as you are would ever think of dishonouring either me or my husband, a valiant knight, who has served you so faithfully, and who now lies in a doleful prison on your account? Certainly, sir, this would not redound to your glory, nor would you be the better for it, if you could have your wayward will." The virtuous lady then quitted the king, who was astonished at her words. She went into the hall to hasten dinner. Afterwards she approached the king's chamber, attended by all the knights, and said to him, "My lord king, your knights are all waiting for you, to wash your hands, for they as well as yourself have fasted too long." King Edward left his apartment and came to the hall, where, after he had washed his hands, he seated himself with his knights at the dinner, as did the lady also. But the king ate very little, and was the whole time pensive, casting his eyes, whenever he had the opportunity, on the countess. Such behaviour surprised his friends, for they were not accustomed to it, never having seen the like before in their king. They supposed it was his chagrin at the departure of the Scots without a battle. The king remained at the castle the whole day, without knowing what to do with himself. Thus did he pass that day and a sleepless night, debating the matter with his own heart. At daybreak he rose, drew out his whole army, raised his camp, and made ready to follow the Scots. Upon taking leave of the countess, he said, "My dear lady, God preserve you safe till I return, and I pray that you will think well of what I have said, and have the goodness to give me a different answer." "My gracious liege," replied the countess, "God of his infinite goodness preserve you, and drive from your noble heart such villainous thoughts, for I am, and ever shall be, ready to serve you, but only in what is consistent with my honour and with yours." The king left her, quite astonished at her answers. The love of King Edward wandered from Queen Philippa, but for a short time, yet it was owing to the high principles of Catherine the Fair that he never swerved into the commission of evil. Queen Philippa, attired in the august robes of the new order of the Garter, and attended by the ladies whom the gallantry of King Edward associated with his knights, assisted her royal lord in holding the first charter at Windsor on St. George's Day, 1344. Philippa kept the birthday of her mighty lord with great festivity at Woodstock in the year 1345. Here, in that sylvan palace, where she had spent the first years of her happy wedlock, did she find herself, in middle life, surrounded by a train of beautiful children, at the head of whom was Edward, Prince of Wales, then on the eve of winning his vast meed of renown. Philippa's protege, Chaucer, has in these elegant lines described one lovely feature of the favourite retreat of his royal mistress. He speaks of a maple that is fair and green before the chamber windows of the queen at Woodstock. End of section 19. Section 20 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ann Boulais. Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. Philippa of Hainault, Chapter 2, Part 1. In the first years of her marriage, Queen Philippa had been the constant attendant on her husband in his campaigns. The annals of the year 1346 display her character in a more brilliant light, as the sagacious ruler of his kingdom and the victorious leader of his army. After the order of the Garter had been fully established, King Edward reminded his valiant knights and nobles that, with him, they made a vow to assist distressed ladies. He then specified that the Countess de Montfort particularly required the aid of his chivalry, for her lord was held in captivity by Philip de Valois in the towers of the Louvre, while the Countess was endeavouring to uphold the cause of her infant son against the whole power of France. He signified his intention of giving his personal support to the heroic Countess, and of leaving Queen Philippa as Regent of England during his absence. On St. John the Baptist's Day, the king took leave of Queen Philippa, appointing the Earl of Kent as her assistant in the government of England. The name of her young son, Lionel, a child of 8 years old, was associated with his mother in the regency. Philippa bade farewell to the darling of her heart, her son Edward, then in his 16th year. This young hero accompanied his royal sire in order to win his spurs on the soil of France. The exploits of the heroic boy are well known, but it is not quite so well known that he was opposed, at the field of Checy, to his mother's nearest connections, to her uncle Philip of Valois, and even to Sir John of Hainault, the favourite relative who had ever been treated by the queen as if he were her father. In the true spirit of a mercenary soldier, Sir John had left the service of his niece's husband, in whose employment he had spent the best part of his life, merely because the King of France gave him a higher salary. The first English military dispatch ever written was addressed to Queen Philippa and her council, by Michael Northborough, King Edward's warlike chaplain. It contains a most original and graphic detail of the Battle of Checy. It is dated at the siege, before the town of Calais, for the Battle of Checy was but an interlude of that famous siege. It was now Philippa's turn to do battle royal with the king. As a diversion in favour of France, David of Scotland advanced into England, a fortnight after the Battle of Checy, and burned the suburbs of York. At this juncture Philippa herself hastened to the relief of her northern subjects. Froissart has detailed with great spirit the brilliant conduct of the queen at this crisis. The Queen of England, who was very anxious to defend her kingdom, in order to show she was in earnest about it, came herself to Newcastle upon Tyne. She took up her residence there to wait for her forces. On the morrow the King of Scots, with full 40,000 men, advanced within 3 short miles of the town of Newcastle. He sent to inform the queen that, if her men were willing to come forth from the town, he would wait and give them battle. Philippa answered, that she accepted his offer, and that her barons would risk their lives for the realm of their lord the king. The queen's army drew up in order for battle at Neville's Cross. Philippa advanced among them mounted on her white charger, and entreated her men to do their duty well, in defending the honour of their lord the king, and urged them, for the love of God, to fight manfully. They promised her that they would acquit themselves loyally to the utmost of their power, and perhaps better than if the king had been there in person. The queen then took her leave of them, and recommended them to the protection of God and St. George. There is no vulgar personal bravado of the fighting woman in the character of Philippa. Her courage was wholly moral courage, and her feminine feelings of mercy and tenderness led her, when she had done all that a great queen could do, by encouraging her army to withdraw from the work of carnage, and pray for her invaded kingdom while the battle joined. The English archers gained the battle, which was fought on the lands of Lord Neville. King David was taken prisoner on his homeward retreat, but not without making the most gallant resistance. When the Queen of England, who had tarried in Newcastle while the battle was fought, heard that her army had won the victory, she mounted on her white palfrey and went to the battlefield. She was informed on the way that the King of Scots was the prisoner of a squire named John Copeland, who had rode off with him, no one knew whither. The queen ordered him to be sought out, and told that he had done what was not agreeable to her in carrying off her prisoner without leave. All the rest of the day the queen and her army remained on the battlefield they had won, and then returned to Newcastle for the night. Next day Philippa wrote with her own hand to John Copeland, commanding him to surrender the King of Scots to her. John answered, in a manner most contumacious to the female majesty, then swaying the sceptre of England with so much ability and glory. He replied to Philippa that he would not give up his royal prisoner to woman or child, but only to his own lord, King Edward, for to him he had sworn allegiance, and not to any woman. There spoke the haughty spirit of feudality, which disdained to obey a female regent, although then encamped on a victorious field. The queen was greatly troubled at the obstinacy of this northern squire, and scarcely knew how to depend on the assurance he added, bidding her knight tell the queen she might depend on his taking good care of King David. In this dilemma, Philippa wrote letters to the king her husband, which she sent off directly to Calais. In these letters she informed him of the state of his kingdom. The king ordered John Copeland to come to him at Calais, who, having placed his prisoner in a strong castle in Northumberland, set out and landed near Calais. When the King of England saw the squire, he took him by the hand, saying, "Ha, welcome, my squire, who by thy valour hast captured mine adversary, the King of Scots." John Copeland fell on one knee and replied, "If God, out of his great kindness, has given me the King of Scotland, and permitted me to conquer him in arms, no one ought to be jealous of it, for God can, if he pleases, send his grace to a poor squire, as well as to a great lord. Sire, do not take it amiss if I do not surrender King David to the orders of my lady queen, for I hold my lands of you and not of her, and my oath is to you and not to her, unless indeed through choice." King Edward answered, "John, the loyal service you have done us, and our esteem for your valor is so great, that it may well serve you as an excuse, and shame fall on all those who bear you any ill will. You will now return home and take your prisoner, the King of Scotland, and convey him to my wife. And, by way of remuneration, I assign lands as near your house as you can choose them, to the amount of £500 a year, for you and your heirs." John Copeland left Calais the third day after his arrival, and returned to England. When he was come home, he assembled his friends and neighbours, and, in company with them, took the King of Scots and carried him to York, where he presented him, in the name of King Edward, to Queen Philippa, and made such excuses that she was satisfied. And great magnanimity Philippa displayed in being content with the happy result. How many women would have borne an unextinguishable hatred to John Copeland for a far less offence than refusing obedience to a delegated sceptre? Philippa lodged David in the Tower of London. He was conducted by her orders in grand procession through the streets, mounted on a tall black war horse, that everyone might recognize his person in case of escape. Next day she sailed for Calais, and landed 3 days before All Saints. The arrival of Philippa occasioned a stir of gladness in the besieging camp. Her royal lord held a grand court to welcome his victorious queen, and made a magnificent fete for her ladies. Philippa brought with her the flower of female nobility of England, many ladies being anxious to accompany her to Calais, in order to see fathers, husbands, and brothers, all engaged in this famous siege. While Queen Philippa was encamped with her royal lord before Calais, the young Count of Flanders, who had been kept by Edward in his army as a sort of captive, ran away to the King of France, to avoid his marriage engagements with the Princess Royal, a circumstance which caused great grief and indignation to the Queen and her family. But the conduct of the young Lord of Flanders can scarcely excite wonder, for Edward III, certainly forgetting son métier du roi, was in a strong league with the Count's rebellious subject, the brewer von Artevelde, who, under a pretense of reform, had overturned the government of Flanders, and delivered up its count to the king of England, the states of Flanders having betrothed him to the eldest daughter of Edward, without consulting his inclinations. The young count at last requested an interview with his betrothed. What passed is not known, but the young couple seemed on the most friendly terms with each other, and the queen, supposing the charms of the young Isabella had captivated the unwilling heart of Count Louis, with her usual generosity, requested he might be left unguarded, fancying he would remain Isabella's willing prisoner. But the escape of the count followed soon after, to the great exasperation of Edward III. As Isabella afterwards made a love match, the whole scheme had probably been concerted between her and her betrothed, for life, in the 14th century, was an acted romance. Meantime, the brave defenders of Calais were so much reduced by famine as to be forced to capitulate. At first, Edward resolved to put them all to the sword. By the persuasions of Sir Walter Mauny, he somewhat relaxed from his bloody intentions. He bade Sir Walter, says Froissart, return to Calais with the following terms: "Tell the governor of Calais that the garrison and inhabitants shall be pardoned, excepting 6 of the principal citizens, who must surrender themselves to death, with ropes round their necks, bareheaded and barefooted, bringing the keys of the town and castle in their hands." Sir Walter returned to the brave governor of Calais, John de Vienne, who was waiting for him on the battlements, and told him all he had been able to gain from the king. The lord of Vienne went to the marketplace, and caused the bell to be rung, upon which all the inhabitants assembled in the town hall. He then related to them what he had said, and the answers he had received, and that he could not obtain better conditions. Then they broke into lamentations of grief and despair, so that the hardest heart would have had compassion on them, and their valiant governor, Lord de Vienne, wept bitterly. After a short pause, the most wealthy citizen of Calais, by name Eustace St. Pierre, rose up and said, "Gentlemen, both high and low, it would be pity to suffer so many of our countrymen to die through famine. It would be highly meritorious in the eyes of our Saviour, if such misery could be prevented. If I die to serve my dear townsmen, I trust I shall find grace before the tribunal of God. I name myself first of the 6. When Eustace had done speaking, his fellow citizens all rose up and almost adored him, casting themselves on their knees, with tears and groans. Then another citizen rose up, and said he would be the second to Eustace. His name was John Dare. After him, John Wisant, who was very rich in money and lands, and kinsman to Eustace and John. His example was followed by Peter Wisant, his brother. 2 others then offered themselves, which completed the number demanded by King Edward. The governor mounted a small horse, for it was with difficulty he could walk, and conducted them through the gate to the barriers. He said to Sir Walter, who was there waiting for him, "I deliver up to you, as governor of Calais, these 6 citizens, and swear to you they were, and are to this day, the most wealthy and respectable inhabitants of the town. I beg of you, gentle sir, that of your goodness you would beseech the king that they may not be put to death." "I cannot answer what the king will do with them," replied Sir Walter, "but you may depend upon this, that I will do all I can to save them." The barriers were then opened, and the 6 citizens were conducted to the pavilion of King Edward. When Sir Walter Mauny had presented these 6 citizens to the king, they fell upon their knees, and with uplifted hands said, "Most gallant king, see before you 6 citizens of Calais, who have been capital merchants, and who bring you the keys of the town and castle. We surrender ourselves to your absolute will and pleasure, in order to save the remainder of our fellow citizens and inhabitants of Calais, who have suffered great distress and misery. Condescend, then, out of your nobleness, to have compassion on us." All the English barons, knights, and squires, that were assembled there in great numbers, wept at this sight. But King Edward eyed them with angry looks, for he hated much the people of Calais, because of the great losses he had suffered at sea by them. Forthwith he ordered the heads of the 6 citizens to be struck off. All present entreated the king to be more merciful, but he would not listen to them. Then Sir Walter Mauny spoke. Ah, gentle king, I beseech you restrain your anger. Tarnish not your noble reputation by such an act as this. Truly the whole world will cry out on your cruelty, if you should put to death these 6 worthy persons. For all this, the king gave a wink to his marshal and said, I will have it so, and ordered the headsman to be sent for, adding, the men of Calais had done him such damage, it was fit they suffered for it. At this, the Queen of England, who was very near her lying in, fell on her knees before King Edward, and with tears said, Ah, gentle sir, sithence I have crossed the sea with great peril to see you, I have never asked you one favour. Now I most humbly ask as a gift, for the sake of the Son of the Blessed Mary, and as a proof of your love to me, the lives of these 6 men. King Edward looked at her for some time in silence, and then said, Ah, lady, I wish you had been anywhere else than here. You have entreated in such a manner that I cannot refuse you. I therefore give them you. Do as you please with them. The queen conducted the 6 citizens to her apartment, and had the halters taken from about their necks. After which she new clothed them, and served them with a plentiful dinner. She then presented each with 6 nobles, and had them escorted out of the camp in safety. The French historians, who, from mortified national pride, have endeavoured to invalidate this beautiful incident, pretend to do so by proving, as an inconsistency in the character of Philippa, that she took possession, a few days after the surrender of Calais, of the tenements belonging to one of her protégés, John Dare. They have likewise impugned the patriotism of Eustace St. Pierre, because he remained in Calais as Edward's subject. But King Edward granted immunity to all those who swore allegiance to him and stayed in Calais, while those who chose expatriation, like John Dare, forfeited their tenements, which they certainly could not take with them. Now, Froissart has shown that Edward presented his Calaisian captives to his queen, to do with them what she pleased. This transfer gave Philippa rights over their persons and property, which she used most generously in regard to the first, but retained her claims over the possessions of the town, of those who refused to become subjects to her husband. The very fact, proved by deeds and charters, that Philippa became proprietress of John Dare's houses, greatly authenticates the statement of Froissart. It would have been pleasant to record that Philippa restored the value of John Dare's tenements, but biography, unlike poetry or romance, seldom permits us to portray a character approaching perfection. Truth compels us to display the same person, by terms, merciful or ferocious, generous or acquisitive, according to the mutability of human passion. The philosophic observer of life will see no outrage on probability in the facts that Philippa saved John Dare's life one day, and took possession of his vacated spoils the next week. The king, after he had bestowed these 6 citizens on Queen Philippa, called to him Sir Walter Mauny and his 2 marshals, the Earls of Warwick and Stafford, and said, My lords, here are the keys of Calais town and castle. Go and take possession. Directions were given for the castle to be prepared with proper lodgings for the king and queen. When this had been done, the king and queen mounted their steeds and rode towards the town, which they entered with the sound of trumpets, drums, and all sorts of warlike instruments. The king remained in Calais till the queen was brought to bed of a daughter named Margaret. 3 days before Edward and Philippa returned to England, the Emperor Louis of Bavaria died, who had married Margarite of Hainault, the eldest sister of the queen. Towards the close of the same year, Edward was elected Emperor of Germany, an honor of which he very wisely declined to accept. At this time it was considered that the royal Philippa and her husband had touched the height of human prosperity. With the exception of the trifling disappointment in the disposal of the hand of her eldest daughter, the year 1347 closed most auspiciously for Philippa and her warlike lord. But the military triumphs of England brought with them some corruption of manners. At that time the jewels and ornaments that once decorated the females of France were transferred to the persons of the English ladies, who, out of compliment to the queen's successful generalship, and the personal heroism of the valiant Countess of Montfort, her kinswoman, began to give themselves the airs of warriors. They wore small jeweled daggers as ornaments at their bosoms, and their caps, formed of cambric or lawn, were cut like the aperture of a knight's helmet. But these objectionable caps brought their own punishment with them, being hideously unbecoming. The church was preparing suitable remonstrances against these unfeminine proceedings, when all pride, whether royal or national, was at once signally confounded by the awful visitation of pestilence which approached the shores of England 1348. This pestilence was called, emphatically, from its effects on the human body, the Black Death. Every household in London was smitten, and some wholly exterminated. Nor did Philippa's royal family escape, for the cruel pestilence robbed her of the fairest of her daughters, under circumstances of peculiar horror. The beauty and graces of the second daughter of Philippa, called the Princess Joanna of Woodstock, were such as to be the themes of every minstrel. She was in her 15th year, when Alfonso, king of Castile, demanded her in marriage for his heir, the infant Pedro, who afterwards attained an undesirable celebrity under the name of Pedro the Cruel. The princess had been nurtured and educated by that virtuous lady, Marie St. Paul, the widowed Countess of Pembroke, to whose munificent love of learning Cambridge owes one of her noblest foundations. As a reward for rearing and educating the young princess, King Edward gave the countess, her governess, the manor of Stroud, in Kent, with many expressions of gratitude, calling her his dearest cousin Marie de St. Paul. The fair Joanna was spared the torment of becoming the wife of the most furious man in Europe, by the more merciful plague of the Black Death. The royal bride sailed for Bordeaux at the latter end of the summer of 1348, while her father-in-law, the King of Castile, travelled to the frontier city Bayonne with the infant Don Pedro to meet her. King Edward's loyal citizens of Bordeaux escorted the Princess Joanna as far as Bayonne, in the cathedral of which city she was to give her hand to Pedro. On the very evening of her triumphal entry into Bayonne, the pestilence, out of all the assembled multitudes, seized on the fair young Plantagenet as a victim. It terminated her existence in a few hours. Her Spanish bridegroom and the king, his father, followed her funeral procession on the very day and hour she was appointed to give her hand as a bride, at the altar of that cathedral wherein she was buried. A deep grief of the parents of Joanna is visible in the Latin letters, written by Edward III to the King of Castile, to Don Pedro, and to the Queen of Castile. If the Latinity of these letters will not bear the criticism of the classical scholar, they are, nevertheless, lofty in sentiment, and breathe an expression of parental tenderness seldom to be found in state papers. Your daughter and ours, he says to the Queen of Castile, was by nature wonderfully endowed with gifts and graces, but little does it now avail to praise them or specify the charms of that beloved one, who is, O grief of heart, forever taken from us. Yet the debt of mortality must be paid, however deeply sorrow may drive the thorn, and our hearts be transpierced by anguish. Nor will our sighs and tears cancel the inevitable law of nature. Christ, the celestial spouse, has taken the maiden bride to be his spouse. She, in her innocent and immaculate years, has been transferred to the virgin choir in heaven, where, for us below, she will perpetually intercede. The queen must have imagined that her royal and handsome progeny was doomed to a life of celibacy, for some extraordinary accident or other had hitherto prevented the marriage of her daughters. Her heroic son Edward had been on the point of marrying several princesses, without his nuptials ever being brought to a conclusion. A long attachment had subsisted between him and his beautiful cousin Joanna, daughter of his uncle, Edmund, Earl of Kent, and the lady had remained unwedded till her 25th year, after being divorced from the Earl of Salisbury, to whom she had been contracted in her infancy. Queen Philippa had a great objection to her son's union with his cousin, on account of the flightiness of the lady's disposition, After vainly hoping for the royal consent to her union with her cousin, Joanna gave her hand to Sir Thomas Holland, but still the Black Prince remained a bachelor. After the grand crisis of the capture of Calais, Philippa resided chiefly in England. Our country felt the advantage of the beneficent presence of its queen. Philippa had in her youth established the woolen manufactories. She now turned her sagacious intellect towards working the coal mines in Tynedale, a branch of national industry whose inestimable benefits need not be dilated upon. The mines had been worked with great profit in the reign of Henry III, but the convulsions of the Scottish wars had stopped their progress. Philippa had estates in Tynedale, and she had long resided in its vicinity during Edward's Scottish campaigns. It was an infallible result that, wherever this great queen directed her attention, wealth and national prosperity speedily followed. Well did her actions illustrate her Flemish motto, Ike rude muque, which obsolete words may be rendered, I labour or toil much. Soon after her return from Calais, she obtained a grant from her royal lord, giving permission to her bailiff, Alan de Strother, to work the mines of Alderneston, which had been worked in the days of King Henry III and Edward I. From this reopening of the Tynedale mines by Philippa proceeded our coal trade, which, during the reign of her grandson, Henry IV, enriched the great merchant Whittington and the city of London. The queen continued to increase the royal family. The Princess Mary, who afterwards married the Duke of Bretagne, Prince William, born at Windsor, died in his 12th year. Edmund, afterwards Duke of York, and Blanche, of the Tower, were born before the surrender of Calais. The Princess Margaret and Thomas of Woodstock afterwards. Edward's presents to his queen on these occasions were munificent. One of his grants is thus affectionately worded. July 20. King orders his exchequer to pay our Philippa, our dearest consort, £500, to liquidate the expenses of her churching at Windsor. This was on occasion of the birth of Prince William, Philippa's second son of that name. Philippa did not disdain the alliance of the great English nobles. Her objection to the union of Edward, her chivalric heir, with Joanna the Fair, arose solely from disapprobation of the moral character of that princess. Her next surviving son, Lionel, she not only united to an English maiden, but undertook the worship and education of his young bride, as may be learned from this document. January 1, 1347. Edward III gives to his dearest consort, Philippa, the wardship of the person of Elisabeth de Burgh, daughter of the deceased Earl of Ulster, slain in Ireland, with her lands and lordships, until Lionel, yet in tender years, shall take the young Elisabeth to wife. 2 of Philippa's sons were married to English women by her special agency. End of section 20. Section 21 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ann Boulais. Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland. Philippa of Hainault, Chapter 2, Part 2. Queen Philippa, with her son the Black Prince, paid a visit to Norwich in 1350, and there held a magnificent tournament. The royal mother and her heroic son were received by the inhabitants of the city, enriched by her statistical wisdom, with the utmost gratitude, and were entertained by the corporation at an expense of £37, 4 shillings 6½, as appears by their records. The grand victory of Poictiers distinguished the year 1357. A prouder day than that of Neville's Cross was the 5th of May, 1357, when Edward the Black Prince landed at Sandwich with his royal prisoner, King John, and presented him to his mother after that glorious entry into London, where the prince tacitly gave John the honours of a suzerain by permitting him to mount the famous white charger on which he rode at Poictiers, and which was captured with him. At the same time that the queen received her vanquished kinsman, her son presented to her another prisoner, who, young as he was far fiercer in his captivity than the king of France. This was Philip, the fourth son of King John, a little hero of 14, who had fought desperately by his father's side on the lost field, and had been captured with some difficulty alive, and not till he was desperately wounded. The first day of his arrival at the court of England he gave a proof of his fierceness, by starting from the table where he sat at dinner with the king and queen and his father, and boxing the ears of King Edward's cupbearer for serving the King of England before the King of France. For, he said, though his father, King John, was unfortunate, he was the sovereign of the King of England. Edward and Philippa only smiled at the boy's petulance, and treated him with indulgent benevolence. And when he quarrelled with the Prince of Wales, at a game of chess, they most courteously decided the disputed move in favour of Prince Philip. That renowned champion, Sir Bertrand du Guesclin, was one of the prisoners of Poitiers. One day, when Queen Philippa was entertaining at her court a number of the noble French prisoners, the Prince of Wales proposed that Du Guesclin should name his own ransom, according to the etiquette of the times, adding, that whatever sum he mentioned, be it small or great, should set him free. The valiant Breton valued himself at 100,000 crowns. The Prince of Wales started at the immense sum, and asked Sir Bertrand how he could ever expect to raise such an enormous ransom. "I know," replied the hero, "100 knights in my native Bretagne, who would mortgage their last acre, rather than Du Guesclin should either languish in captivity or be rated below his value. Yea, and there is not a woman in France now toiling at her distaff, who would not devote a year's earnings to set me free, for well have I deserved of their sex. And if all the fair spinners in France employ their hands to redeem me, think you, Prince, whether I shall bide much longer with you?" Queen Philippa, who had listened with great attention to the discussion between her son and his prisoner, now spoke. "I name," she said, 50,000 crowns, my son, as my contributions towards your gallant prisoner's ransom. For though an enemy to my husband, a knight who is famed for the courteous protection he has afforded to my sex, deserves the assistance of every woman." Du Guesclin immediately threw himself at the feet of the generous queen, saying, "Ah, lady, being the ugliest knight in France, I never reckoned on any goodness from your sex, excepting from those whom I aided or protected by my sword. But your bounty will make me think less despicably of myself." Philippa, as is usual in the brightest specimens of female excellence, was the friend of her own sex, and honoured those men most who paid the greatest reverence to women. The most glorious festival ever known in England was that held at Windsor in the commencement of the year 1358, for the diversion of the two royal prisoners, John, King of France, and David Bruce of Scotland. The round tower at Windsor, despite the heavy expenses of war, was completed, on purpose that the feast, called the Round Table of the Knights of the Garter, might be held within it. The captive majesties of France and Scotland were invited to that feast as guests, and sat one on each side of Edward III. King John and King David tilted at the lists. The interest of the ceremony was further enhanced by the fatal accident which befell the stout Earl of Salisbury, who was killed in one of the encounters at the lists. Report says that King John of France was still more captivated with the beauty of Lady Salisbury than King Edward had been, and as hopelessly, for that fair and virtuous woman retired into the deepest seclusion after the calamitous death of her lord. After the Windsor festival, Edward placed King John in an irksome captivity, and prepared for the reinvasion of France. Queen Philippa embarked, with her husband, for the new campaign, on the 29th of October, 1359. All her sons were with the army, excepting the little prince, Thomas of Woodstock, who, at the redoubtable age of 5 years, was left guardian of the kingdom, and represented the majesty of his father's person, by sitting on the throne when parliaments were held. After Edward had marched through France without resistance, and, if the truth must be spoken, desolating as he went, a bleeding and suffering country in a most ungenerous manner, his career was stopped, as he was hastening to lay siege to Paris, by the hand of God itself. One of those dreadful thunderstorms which at distant cycles pass over the continent of France literally attacked the invading army within 2 leagues of Chartres, and wreaked its utmost fury on the proud chivalry of England. 6,000 of Edward's finest horses, and 1,000 of his bravest cavaliers, among whom were the heirs of Warwick and Morley, were struck dead before him. The guilty ambition of Edward smote his conscience. He knelt down on the spot, and, spreading his hands toward the church of Our Lady of Chartres, vowed to stop the effusion of blood, and make peace on the spot with France. His queen, who wished well for the noble-minded king of France, held him to his resolution, and a peace, containing tolerable articles for France, was concluded at Bretagne. The queen, King Edward, and the royal family returned, and landed at Rye, 18th of May, 10 days after the peace. After the triumph of Poitiers, the king and queen no longer opposed the union of the Prince of Wales with Joanna the Fair, although that princess was 4 years older than Edward, and her character and disposition were far from meeting the approval of the queen. Edward and Joanna were married in the queen's presence, at Windsor Chapel, October 10, 1361. After this marriage, King Edward invested his son with the Duchy of Aquitaine, and he departed, with his bride, in an evil hour, to govern that territory. Froissart, speaking of the farewell visit of the queen, says, I, John Froissart, author of these chronicles, was in the service of Queen Philippa, when she accompanied King Edward and the royal family to Berkhamsted Castle, to take leave of the Prince and Princess of Wales on their departure for Aquitaine. I was at that time 24 years old, and one of the clerks of the chamber to my lady the queen. During this visit, as I was seated on a bench, I heard an ancient knight expounding some of the prophecies of Merlin to the queen's ladies. According to him, neither the Prince of Wales nor the Duke of Clarence, though sons of King Edward, will wear the crown of England, but it will fall to the house of Lancaster. This gives a specimen of the conversation with which maids of honor in the reign of Queen Philippa were entertained, not with scandal or fashions, but with the best endeavours of an ancient knight to tell a fortune or peep into futurity, by the assistance of the wizard Merlin. King John, soon after the peace, took leave of the queen, for the purpose of returning to France, that he might arrange for the payment of his ransom. He sent to England the young Lord de Courcy, Count of Soissons, as one of the hostages for its liquidation. During the sojourn of de Courcy in England, he won the heart of Lady Isabella, the eldest daughter of Edward and Philippa. After remaining some time in France, and finding it impossible to fulfill his engagements, King John returned to his captivity, and redeemed his parole and his hostages with this noble sentiment: If honor were lost elsewhere upon earth, it ought to be found in the conduct of kings. Froissart thus describes the return of that heroic but unfortunate sovereign. News was brought to the king, who was at that time with Queen Philippa at Eltham, a very magnificent palace the English kings have 7 miles from London, that the captive king had landed at Dover. This was in 1364, the 1st of January. King Edward sent off a grand deputation, saying how much he and the queen were rejoiced to see him in England, and this, it may be supposed, all things considered, King John readily believed. King John offered at the shrine of Thomas a Becket at Canterbury on his journey, and taking the road to London, he arrived at Eltham, where Queen Philippa and King Edward were ready to receive him. It was on a Sunday in the afternoon. There were, between that time and supper, many grand dances and carols, at which it seems the young Lord de Courcy distinguished himself by singing and dancing. I can never relate how very honourably the king and queen behaved to King John at Eltham. They afterwards lodged him with great pomp in the palace of the Savoy, where he visited King Edward at Westminster whenever he had a mind to see him or the queen, taking boat, and coming from Savoy stairs by water to the palace. But King John's health was declining, and he died at the Savoy Palace the same year. The marriage soon after took place between the elegant de Courcy and the Princess Royal. Although an emperor's grandson, this nobleman could scarcely be considered a match for the daughter of Edward III. But since the escape of her faithless betrothed, the Count of Flanders, Isabella had entered into no marriage contract, and was, at the time of her nuptials, turned of 30. On occasion of the marriage festivals, King Edward presented his queen with 2 rich corsets, one embroidered with the words Mine Bidene, and the other with her motto Icke rude muque. Prince Lionel at this time espoused the ward of Queen Philippa, Elisabeth de Burgh, who brought, as a dower, at least 1/3 of Ireland, with the mighty inheritance of the Clares, Earls of Gloucester. Edward III afterwards created Lionel Duke of Clarence. This prince, through whose daughter, married to Edmund Mortimer, the line of York derived its primogeniture, was a handsome and courageous Flemish giant, mild-tempered and amiable, as persons of great strength and stature, by a beneficent law of nature, usually are. Lionel is rather an obscure, though important person in English history. Here is his portrait by the last of our rhyming chroniclers. In all the world there was no prince him like, of high stature and all seemliness, above all men within the whole kingdom. By the shoulders might be seen, doubtless, in hall was he made like for gentleness, in other places famed for rhetoric, but in the field a lion marmorike. Death soon dissolved the wedlock of Elisabeth de Burgh. She left a daughter but a few days old. This motherless babe the Queen Philippa adopted for her own, and became sponsor to her, with the Countess of Warwick, as we learn from the friar's genealogy, when mentioning Lionel of Clarence. His wife was dead and at Clare buried, and no heir had be but his daughter fair, Philippe, that hight as chronicle specified, whom Queen Philippe christened for his heir, the Archbishop of York for her compeer, her godmother also of Warwick Countess, a lady likewise of great worthiness. John of Gaunt, the 3rd surviving son of Philippa, married Blanche, the heiress of Lancaster. The Princess Mary was wedded to the Duke of Bretagne, but died early in life. Edmund Langley, Earl of Cambridge, afterwards Duke of York, married Isabella of Castille, whose sister, his brother, John of Gaunt, took for his second wife. The youngest prince, Thomas of Woodstock, afterwards created Duke of Gloucester, married an English lady, the co-heiress of Humphrey de Bohun, Constable of England. Margaret, the 5th daughter of Edward III, was given in marriage to the Earl of Pembroke. She was one of the most learned ladies of her age, and a distinguished patroness of Chaucer. Notwithstanding their great strength and commanding stature, scarcely one of the sons of Philippa reached old age. Even John of Gaunt, time-honoured Lancaster, was only 59 at his demise. The premature introduction to the cares of state, the weight of plate armour, and the violent exercise in the tilt-yard, by way of relaxation from the severer toils of partisan warfare, seem to have brought early old age on this gallant brotherhood of princes. The queen had been the mother of 12 children. 8 survived her. Every one of the sons of Philippa were famous champions in the field. The Black Prince and John of Gaunt were learned, elegant, and brilliant, and strongly partook of the genius of Edward I and the Provençal Plantagenets. Lionel and Edmund were good-natured and brave. They were comely in features, and gigantic in stature. They possessed no great vigour of intellect, and were both rather addicted to the pleasures of the table. Thomas of Woodstock was fierce, petulant, and rapacious. He possessed, however, considerable accomplishments, and is reckoned among the royal and noble authors. He wrote a history of the laws of battle, which is perspicuous in style. He was the great patron of Gower the poet, who belonged originally to the household of this prince. The queen saw the promise of a successor to the throne of England in the progeny of her best beloved son Edward. Her grandson Richard was born at Bordeaux before she succumbed to her final malady. Philippa had not the misery of living to see the change in the prosperity of her family, to witness the long pining decay of the heroic Prince of Wales, the grievous change in his health and disposition, or the imbecility that gradually took possession of the once mighty mind of her husband. Before these reverses took place, the queen was seized with a dropsical malady, under which she languished about 2 years. All her sons were absent on the continent when her death approached, excepting her youngest, Thomas of Woodstock. The Black Prince had just concluded his Spanish campaign and was ill in Gascony. Lionel of Clarence was at the point of death in Italy. The queen's secretary, Froissart, had accompanied that prince when he went to be married to Violante of Milan. On the return of Froissart, he found his royal mistress was dead, and he thus describes her deathbed from the detail of those who were present and heard her last words. I must now speak of the death of the most courteous, liberal, and noble lady that ever reigned in her time, the Lady Philippa of Hainault, Queen of England. While her son, the Duke of Lancaster, was encamped in the valley of Torneham, ready to give battle to the Duke of Burgundy, this death happened in England, to the infinite misfortune of King Edward, his children, and the whole kingdom. That excellent lady queen, who had done so much good, aiding all knights, ladies, and damsels when distressed, who had applied to her, was at this time dangerously sick at Windsor Castle, and every day her disorder increased. When the good queen perceived that her end approached, she called the king, and extending her right hand from under the bedclothes, put it into the right hand of King Edward, who was oppressed with sorrow, and thus spoke: We have, my husband, enjoyed our long union in happiness, peace, and prosperity. But I entreat you, before I depart, and we are forever separated in this world, that you will grant me 3 requests. King Edward, with sighs and tears, replied, Lady, name them. Whatever be your requests, they shall be granted. My lord, she said, I beg you will fulfill whatever engagements I have entered into with merchants for their fares, as well on this as on the other side of the sea. I beseech you to fulfill whatever gifts or legacies I have made, or left to churches wherein I have paid my devotions, and to all my servants, whether male or female. And when it shall please God to call you hence, you will choose no other sepulchre than mine, and that you will lie by my side in the cloisters of Westminster Abbey. The king in tears replied, Lady, all this shall be done. Soon after, the good lady made the sign of the cross on her breast, and having recommended to the king her youngest son Thomas, who was present, praying to God, she gave up her spirit, which I firmly believe was caught up by holy angels, and carried to the glory of heaven, for she had never done anything by thought or deed to endanger her soul. Thus died this admirable Queen of England, in the year of grace 1369, the vigil of the Assumption of the Virgin, the 14th of August. Information of this heavy loss was carried to the English army at Torneham, which greatly afflicted every one, more especially her son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Philippa's words were not complied with to the letter. Her grave is not by her husband's side at Westminster Abbey, but at his feet. Her statue in alabaster is placed on the monument. Skelton's translation of her Latin epitaph, hung on a tablet close by her tomb, is as follows: Fair Philippe, William Hainault's child, and younger daughter dear, of roseate hue and beauty bright, in tomb lies hilled here. King Edward, through his mother's will and noble's good consent, took her to wife, and joyfully with her his time he spent. Her brother John, a martial man, and eke a valiant knight, did link this woman to this king in bonds of marriage bright. This match and marriage thus in blood did bind the Flemings sure to Englishmen, by which they did the Frenchman's wreck procure. This Philippe, dowered in gifts full rare, and treasures of the mind, in beauty bright, religion, faith, to all and each most kind. A fruitful mother Philippe was, full many a son she bred, and brought forth many a worthy knight, hardy and full of dread. A careful nurse to all students, at Oxford she did found Queen's College, and Dame Paula's school, that did her fame resound. The wife of Edward dear, Queen Philippa lieth here, learn to live. Truth obliges us to divest Queen Philippa of one good deed, which was in fact out of her power to perform. She is generally considered to be the first foundress of the magnificent Queen's College at Oxford. It was founded, indeed, by her chaplain, that noble character, Robert de Egglesfield, who, with modesty equal to his learning and merits, placed it under the protection of his royal mistress, and called it her foundation and the College of the Queen. Philippa herself, the consort of a monarch perpetually engaged in foreign war, and the mother of a large family, contributed but a mite towards this splendid foundation. This was a yearly rent of 20 marks, to the sustenance of 6 scholar chaplains, to be paid by her receiver. Queen Philippa's principal charitable donation was to the Hospital of the Nuns of St. Catherine by the Tower. She likewise left donations to the canons of the new chapel of St. Stephen, which Edward III had lately built, as the domestic place of worship to Westminster Palace. The only shade of unpopularity ever cast on the conduct of Philippa was owing to the rapacity of her purveyors, after her children grew up. The royal family was numerous, and the revenues, impoverished by constant war, were very slender, and therefore every absolute due was enforced, from tenants of the crown, by the purveyors of the royal household. The damsels of the queen's bedchamber were pensioned by King Edward after her death, according to her request. He charges his exchequer to pay during the terms of their separate lives, on account of their good and faithful services to Philippa, late Queen of England. First to the beloved damsel, Alicia de Preston, 10 marks yearly, at Paschke and Michaelmas. Likewise to Matilda Fisher, to Elisabeth Pershore, to Joanna Colley, 10 marks yearly, to Joanna Cousin, to Philippa the Picard, and to Agatha Lirgin, 100 shillings yearly, and to Matilda Radscroft and Agnes de Saxelby, 5 marks yearly. The name of Alice Perrers does not appear on this list of beloved damsels, but a little further on, in the Foedera, occurs a well-known and disgraceful grant. Know all that we give and concede to our beloved Alicia Perrers, late damsel of the chamber of our dearest consort Philippa deceased, and to her heirs and executors, all the jewels, goods, and chattels that the said queen left in the hands of Euphemia, who was wife to Walter de Hesselarton, knight, and the said Euphemia is to deliver them to the said Alicia, on receipt of this order. It is to be feared that the king's attachment to this woman had begun during Philippa's lingering illness, for in 1368 she obtained a gift of a manor that had belonged to the king's aunt, and in the course of 1369 she was enriched by the grant of several manors. But we will not pursue this subject. We are not obliged to trace the events of the dotage and folly of the once great Edward, or show the absurdity of which he was guilty, when he made the infamous Alice Perrers the queen's successor in his affections. During his youth and the brilliant maturity of his life, Philippa's royal partner was worthy of the intense and faithful love she bore him. According to this portrait, Edward was not only a king, but a king among men, highly gifted in mind, person, and genius. Edward III was just 6 feet in stature, exactly shaped and strongly made, his limbs beautifully turned, his face and nose somewhat long and high, but exceedingly comely. His eyes sparkling like fire, his looks manly, his air and movements most majestic. He was well versed in law, history, and the divinity of the times. He understood and spoke readily Latin, French, Spanish, and German. Whilst the court was distracted with the factions which succeeded the death of the Black Prince, when John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, was suspected of aiming at the crown, a most extraordinary story was circulated in England, relating to a confession supposedly made by Queen Philippa, on her deathbed, to William of Wykeham, Bishop of Winchester. That John of Gaunt was neither the son of Philippa nor Edward III, but a porter's son of Ghent, for the queen had told him that she brought forth not a son but a daughter at Ghent, that she overlaid and killed the little princess by accident, and dreading the wrath of King Edward for the death of his infant, she persuaded the porter's wife, a Flemish woman, to change her living son, who was born at the same time, for the dead princess. And so the queen nourished and brought up the man now called Duke of Lancaster, which she bare not. And all these things did the queen on her deathbed declare, in confession to Bishop Wykeham, and earnestly prayed him, that ever it chanceth this son of the Flemish porter affecteth the kingdom, he will make his stock and lineage known to the world, lest a false heir should inherit the throne of England. The inventor of this story did not remember that of all the sons of Philippa, John of Gaunt most resembled his royal sire in the high majestic lineaments and piercing eyes, which spoke of the descent of the Plantagenets of southern Europe. The portraits of Edward III, of the elegant Black Prince, and of John of Gaunt are all marked with as strong an air of individuality as if they had been painted by the accurate Holbein. The close observer of history will not fail to notice that with the life of Queen Philippa, the happiness, the good fortune, and even the respectability of Edward III and his family departed, and scenes of strife, sorrow, and folly distracted the court, where she had once promoted virtue, justice, and well-regulated munificence. End of section 21. Section 22 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ann Boulais. Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland. Anne of Bohemia, Part 1. The ancestors of the Princess Anne of Bohemia originated from the same country as the Flemish Philippa. She was the nearest relative to that beloved queen, whose hand was attainable, and by means of her uncle, Duke Wenceslaus of Brabant, she brought the same popular and profitable commercial alliance to England. Anne of Bohemia was the eldest daughter of the Emperor Charles IV, by his fourth wife, Elisabeth of Pomerania. She was born about 1367 at Prague in Bohemia. The regency who governed England during King Richard II's minority demanded her hand for their young king just before her father died in the year 1380. On the arrival of the English ambassador, Sir Simon Burley, at Prague, the imperial court took measures which seem not a little extraordinary at the present day. England was to Bohemia a sort of terra incognita, and as a general knowledge of geography and statistics was certainly not among the list of imperial accomplishments in the 14th century, the Empress dispatched Duke Primislaus of Saxony on a voyage of discovery to ascertain, for the satisfaction of herself and the princess, what sort of country England might be. Whatever were the particulars of the Duke's discoveries, and his homeward dispatches must have been of a most curious nature, it appears he kept a scrutinizing eye in regard to pecuniary interest. His report seems to have been on the whole satisfactory, since in the Foedera we find a letter from the imperial widow of Charles IV, to the effect that I, Elizabeth, Roman Empress, always Augusta, likewise Queen of Bohemia, empower Duke Primislaus to treat with Richard, King of England, concerning the wedlock of that excellent virgin, the damsel Anne, born of us, and in our name to order and dispose, and, as if our own soul were pledged, to swear to the fulfillment of every engagement. When the Duke of Saxony returned to Germany, he carried presents of jewels from the King of England to the ladies who had the care of the princess's education. The Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt, would willingly have seen the king his nephew married to his daughter, whom he had by the Lady Blanche of Lancaster. But it was thought that the young lady was too nearly related, being the king's cousin german. Sir Simon Burley, a sage and valiant knight, who had been King Richard's tutor, and had been much beloved by the Prince of Wales, his father, was deputed to go to Germany, respecting the marriage with the Emperor's sister. The Duke and Duchess of Brabant, from the love they bore the King of England, received his envoy most courteously and said it would be a good match for their niece. But the marriage was not immediately concluded, for the damsel was young. Added to this, there shortly happened in England great misery and tribulation, by the calamitous insurrection of Wat Tyler. Richard II. was the sole surviving offspring of the gallant Black Prince and Joanna of Kent. Born in the luxurious South, the first accents of Richard of Bordeaux were formed in the poetical language of Provence, and his infant tastes linked to music and song, tastes which assimilated ill with the manners of his own court and people. His mother and half-brothers, after the death of his princely father, had brought up the future King of England with the most ruinous personal indulgence, and unconstitutional ideas of his own infallibility. He had inherited more of his mother's levity than his father's strength of character, yet the domestic affections of Richard were of the most vivid and enduring nature, especially towards the females of his family, and the state of distress and terror to which he saw his mother reduced by the insolence of Wat Tyler's mob, was the chief stimulant of his gallant behaviour when that rebel fell beneath the sword of Walworth. When these troubles were suppressed, time had obviated the objection to the union of Richard and Anne. The young princess had attained her 15th year, and was considered capable of giving a rational consent to her own marriage, and after sending a letter to the Council of England saying, she became the wife of their king with full and free will, she set out, says Froissart, on her perilous journey, attended by the Duke of Saxony and his Duchess, who was her aunt, and with a suitable number of knights and damsels. They came through Brabant to Brussels, where Duke Wenceslaus and his Duchess received the young queen and her company very grandly. The Lady Anne remained with her uncle and aunt more than a month. She was afraid of proceeding, for she had been informed there were 12 large armed vessels full of Normans on the sea between Calais and Holland, that seized and pillaged all that fell in their hands, without any respect to persons. The report was current that they cruised in those seas, awaiting the coming of the King of England's bride, because the King of France and his council were very uneasy at Richard's German alliance, and were desirous of breaking the match. Detained by these apprehensions, the betrothed queen remained at Brussels more than a month, till the Duke of Brabant, her uncle, sent the lords of Roussillons and Boscaor to remonstrate with King Charles V., who was also the near relative of Anne. Upon which King Charles remanded the Norman cruisers into port, but he declared that he granted this favour solely out of love to his cousin Anne, and out of no regard or consideration for the King of England. The Duke and Duchess were very much pleased, and so were all those about to cross the sea. The royal bride took leave of her uncle and aunt, and departed for Brussels. Duke Wenceslaus had the princess escorted with 100 spears. She passed through Bruges, where the Earl of Flanders received her very magnificently, and entertained her for 3 days. She then set out for Gravelines, where the Earl of Salisbury waited for her with 500 spears and as many archers. This noble escort conducted her in triumph to Calais, which belonged to her betrothed lord. Then the Brabant spearmen took their leave, after seeing her safely delivered to the English governor. The Lady Anne stayed at Calais only till the wind became favourable. She embarked on a Wednesday morning, and the same day arrived at Dover, where she tarried to repose herself 2 days. The young bride had need of some interval to compose herself after her narrow escape from destruction. All our native historians notice the following strange fact, which must have originated in a tremendous ground-swell. Scarcely, says the chronicler, had the Bohemian princess set her foot on the shore, when a sudden convulsion of the sea took place, unaccompanied by wind, and unlike any winter storm, but the water was so violently shaken and troubled, and put in such furious commotion, that the ship, in which the young queen's person was conveyed, was very terribly rent in pieces before her very face, and the rest of the vessels that rode in company were tossed so that it astonied all beholders. The English Parliament was sitting, when intelligence came that the king's bride, after all the difficulties and dangers of her progress from Prague, had safely arrived at Dover, on which it was prorogued. But first, funds were appointed, that with all honour the bride might be presented to the young king. On the third day after her arrival, the Lady Anne set forth on her progress to Canterbury, where she was met by the king's uncle Thomas, who received her with the utmost reverence and honour. When she approached the Blackheath, the Lord Mayor and citizens, in splendid dresses, greeted her, and with all the ladies and damsels, both from town and country, joined her cavalcade, making so grand an entry in London that the like had scarcely ever been seen. The goldsmiths' company, 70 of the men of this rich guild, splendidly arrayed themselves to meet, as they said, the Caesar's sister. Nor was their munificence confined to their own persons. They further put themselves to the expense of 60 for the hire of 7 minstrels, with foil on their hats and chaperons, and expensive vestures, to do honour to the imperial bride, and to 2 further expense, for potations for the said minstrels. At the upper end of Cheap was a pageant of a castle with towers, from 2 sides of which ran fountains of wine. From these towers beautiful damsels blew in the faces of the king and queen gold leaf. This was thought a device of extreme elegance and ingenuity. They likewise threw counterfeit gold florins before the horses' feet of the royal party. Anne of Bohemia was married to Richard II in the chapel royal of the Palace of Westminster, the newly erected structure of St. Stephen. On the wedding day, which was the 20th after Christmas, there were, says Froissart, mighty feastings. That gallant and noble knight, Sir Robert Namer, accompanied the queen, from the time when she quitted Prague till she was married. The king at the end of the week carried his queen to Windsor, where he kept open and royal house. They were very happy together. She was accompanied by the king's mother, the Princess of Wales, and her daughter, the Duchess of Bretagne, half-sister to King Richard, who was then in England soliciting for the restitution of the earldom of Richmond, which had been taken from her husband by the English regency, and settled in part of dower on Queen Anne. Some days after the marriage of the royal pair, they returned to London, and the coronation of the queen was performed most magnificently. At the young queen's earnest request, a general pardon was granted by the king, at her consecration. The afflicted people stood in need of this respite, as the executions, since Tyler's insurrection, had been bloody and barbarous beyond all precedent. The land was reeking with the blood of the unhappy peasantry, when the humane intercession of the gentle Anne of Bohemia put a stop to the executions. This mediation obtained for Richard's bride the title of the good Queen Anne, and years, instead of impairing the popularity usually so evanescent in England, only increased the esteem felt by her subjects for this beneficent princess. Grand tournaments were held directly after the coronation. Many days were spent in these solemnities, wherein the German nobles, who had accompanied the queen to England, displayed their chivalry to the great delight of the English. Our chroniclers call Anne of Bohemia the beauteous queen. At 15 or 16, a blooming German girl is a very pleasing object, but her beauty must have been limited to stature and complexion, for the features of her statue are homely and undignified. A narrow, high-pointed forehead, a long upper lip, cheeks whose fullness increased towards the lower part of the face, can scarcely entitle her to claim a reputation for beauty. But the headdress she wore must have neutralized the defects of her face in some degree, by giving an appearance of breadth to her narrow forehead. This was the horn cap which constituted the headgear of the ladies of Bohemia and Hungary, and in this moony tire did the bride of Richard present herself to the astonished eyes of her female subjects. Queen Anne made some atonement for being the importer of these hideous fashions, by introducing the use of pins, such as are used at our present toilets. Our chroniclers declare that, previously to her arrival in England, the English fair fastened their robes with skewers, a great misrepresentation, for, even as early as the Roman Empire, the use of pins was known, and English barrows have been opened, wherein were found numbers of very neat and efficient little ivory pins, which had been used in arranging the grave clothes of the dead. And can these irreverent chroniclers suppose that English ladies used worse fastenings for their robes in the 14th century? Side saddles were the third new fashion brought into England by Anne of Bohemia. They were different from those used at present, which were invented or first adopted by Catherine de Medici, Queen of France. The side saddle of Anne of Bohemia was like a bench with a hanging step, where both feet were placed. This mode of riding required a footman or squire at the bridle rein of the lady's palfrey, and was chiefly used in processions. According to the fashion of the age, the young queen had a device which all her knights were expected to wear at tournaments. But her device was, we think, a very stupid one, being an ostrich with a bit of iron in his mouth. In the celebration of the festival of the Order of the Garter, 1384, Queen Anne wore a robe of violet cloth dyed in grain, the hood lined with scarlet, the robe lined with fur. She was attended by a number of noble ladies who were mentioned as newly received into the society of the Garter. They were habited in the same costume as their young queen. The royal spouse of Anne was remarkable for the foppery of his dress. He had one coat estimated at 30,000 marks. Its chief value must have arisen from the precious stones with which it was adorned. This was called apparel broidered of stone. Notwithstanding the great accession of luxury that followed this marriage, the daughter of the Caesars, as Richard proudly called his bride, not only came portionless to the English throne matrimonial, but her husband had to pay a very handsome sum for the honour of calling her his own. He paid to her brother 10,000 marks for the imperial alliance, besides being at the whole charge of her journey. The jewels of the Duchy of Aquitaine, the floriated coronet, and many brooches in the forms of animals were pawned to the Londoners, in order to raise money for the expenses of the bridal. To Anne of Bohemia is attributed the honour of being the first in that illustrious band of princesses who were the nursing mothers of the Reformation. The Protestant Church inscribes her name at the commencement of the illustrious list, in which are seen those of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Parr, Lady Jane Grey, and Queen Elizabeth. Whether the young queen brought those principles with her, or imbibed them from her mother-in-law, the Princess of Wales, it is not easy to ascertain. A passage quoted by Huss, the Bohemian reformer, leads to the inference that Anne was used to read the Scriptures in her native tongue. It is possible, says Wycliffe, in his work called The Threefold Bond of Love, that our noble Queen of England, sister of the Caesar, may have the Gospel written in 3 languages, Bohemian, German, and Latin. Now, to heredicate her, brand her with heresy, on that account, would be Luciferian folly. The influence of Queen Anne over the mind of her young husband was certainly employed by Joanna, Princess of Wales, to aid her in saving the life of Wycliffe, when in great danger at the Council of Lambeth in 1382. Joanna, Princess of Wales, was a convert of Wycliffe, who had been introduced to her by his patron, the Duke of Lancaster. Joanna, aided by her daughter-in-law, swayed the ductile mind of King Richard to their wishes. Soon after, the queen was separated from her husband by a war in Scotland. The most remarkable incident of his campaign was the murder of Lord Stafford by the king's half-brother, John Holland. Jealousy of the queen's favour and malice against her adherents appear to be the secret motives of this deed. Stafford was a peerless chevalier, adored by the English army, and, for his virtuous conduct, in high favour with Anne of Bohemia, who called him her knight, and he was actually on his way to London with messages from the king to the queen when this fatal encounter took place. The ostensible cause of the murder likewise was connected with the queen, as we learn from Froissart that archers of Lord Stafford, when protecting Sir Melas, a Bohemian knight then with the army, who was a friend of Queen Anne, slew a favourite squire belonging to Sir John Holland. And to revenge a punishment which this man had brought upon himself, Sir John cut Lord Stafford down without any personal provocation. The grief of the Earl of Stafford, his entreaties for justice on the murderer of his son, and, above all, the atrocious circumstances of the case wrought on King Richard to vow that an exemplary act of justice should be performed on John Holland, brother though he might be, as soon as he ventured from the shrine of St. John of Beverley, whither this homicide had fled for sanctuary. In vain Joanna, Princess of Wales, the mutual mother of the king and murderer, pleaded with Richard, after his return from Scotland, that the life of Sir John might be spared. After 4 days' incessant lamentation, the king's mother died on the 5th day, at the royal castle of Wallingford. Richard's resolution failed him at this catastrophe, and, when too late to save his mother, he pardoned the criminal. The aggrieved persons, in this unhappy adventure, were the friends of the queen, but there is no evidence that she excited her husband's wrath. The homicide who had occasioned so much trouble departed on an atoning pilgrimage to Syria. He was absent from England during the life of Queen Anne, and happy would it have been for his brother if he had never returned. Anne of Bohemia, unlike Isabella of France, who was always at war with her husband's favorites and friends, made it a rule of life to love all that the king loved, and to consider a sedulous compliance with his will as her first duty. In one instance alone did this pliancy of temper lead her into the violation of justice. This was the case of the reputation of the Countess of Oxford. There were great murmurings against the Duke of Ireland, says Froissart, but what injured him most was his conduct to his duchess, the Lady Philippa, daughter of the Lord de Courcy, a handsome and noble lady. For the duke was greatly enamoured with one of the queen's damsels, called the Landgraven. She was a tolerably handsome, pleasant woman, whom Queen Anne had brought with her from Bohemia. The Duke of Ireland loved her with such ardour that he was desirous of making her, if possible, his duchess by marriage. All the good people of England were much shocked at this, for his lawful wife was granddaughter to the gallant King Edward and the excellent Queen Philippa, being the daughter of the Princess Isabella. Her uncles, the Dukes of Gloucester and York, were very wroth at this insult. The first and last error of Anne of Bohemia was the participation in this disgraceful transaction, by which she was degraded in the eyes of subjects who had warmly admired her meek virtues. The offensive part taken by the queen in this transaction was, that she actually wrote with her own hand an urgent letter to Pope Urban, persuading him to sanction the divorce of the Countess of Oxford, and to authorize the marriage of her faithless lord with the Landgraven. Whether the maid of honour were a princess or a peasant, she had no right to appropriate another man's husband. The queen was scarcely less culpable in aiding and abetting so nefarious a measure, to the infinite injury of herself and of the consort she so tenderly loved. There was scarcely an earl in England who was not related to the royal family. The queen, by the part she took in this disgraceful affair, offended every one allied to the royal house of Plantagenet. The storm fell in its fury on the head of the unfortunate Sir Simon Burley, the same knight whom we have seen make 2 journeys to Prague, in solemn embassy, regarding the queen's marriage. This unfortunate knight, who was the most accomplished man of his age, had been foredoomed by his persecutors. The Earl of Arundel had previously expressed an opinion to King Richard that Sir Simon de Burley deserved death. Didst thou not say to me in the time of thy parliament, when we were in the bath behind the Whitehall, that Sir Simon de Burley deserved to be put to death on several accounts? And did not I make answer, I know no reason why he should suffer death? And yet you and your companions traitorously took his life from him. Such was the accusation by King Richard, when Arundel stood on his trial, to pay the bitter debt of vengeance that Richard had noted against him as the cause of his tutor's death. The death of Sir Simon Burley was a bitter sorrow to the queen, perhaps her first sorrow, and as it appears that the expenses of her journey from Germany, being left unpaid by the government during the king's minority, ultimately led to the disgrace of her friend, the queen must have considered herself as the innocent cause of his death. While the executions of Sir Simon Burley and many others of the king's adherents were proceeding in London, Richard and his queen retired to Bristol and fixed their residence in the castle. End of section 22. Section 23 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ann Boulais. Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland. Anne of Bohemia, Part 2. A civil war commenced which terminated in the defeat of the royal troops at Radcot Bridge, near Oxford, by the Duke of Gloucester and young Henry of Bolingbroke. It was the Queen's mediation alone that could induce Richard to receive the Archbishop of Canterbury, when he came to propose an amnesty between the king and his subjects. 2 days and nights did Richard remain inflexible, till at last, by the persuasion of Anne, the archbishop was admitted to the royal presence. Many plans, says Froissart, were proposed to the king. At last, by the good advice of the queen, he restrained his choler, and agreed to accompany the archbishop to London. After the queen returned to London from Bristol, the proceedings of that parliament commenced, which has been justly termed by history the merciless. The queen's servants were principal objects of its vengeance, the tendency to Lollardism in her household being probably the secret motive. It was in vain that the Queen of England humbled herself to the very dust, in hopes of saving her faithful friends. King Richard, in an especial manner, instanced the undutifulness of the Earl of Arundel to the queen, who, he declared, was 3 hours on her knees before this earl, pleading with tears for the life of John Calverley, one of her esquires. All the answer she could get was this: "Pray for yourself and your husband, for that is the best thing you can do, and let this request alone." And all the importunities used could not save Calverley's life. Indeed, the Duke of Gloucester and his colleagues established a reign of terror, making it penal for anyone to testify fidelity to the king or queen, or to receive their confidence. The Duke of Ireland fled to the Low Countries, from whence he never returned during his life. It is worthy to remark that the niece of his ill-treated wife, for whose divorce Anne of Bohemia had intrigued with Pope Urban, married the great and powerful Emperor Sigismund, own brother to that queen. The intermediate time, from the autumn of 1387 to the spring of 1389, was spent by the young king and queen in a species of restraint. Eltham and Sheen were the favorite residences of Richard and Anne, and in these palaces they chiefly sojourned at this time. The favorite summer palace of Anne was named, from the lovely landscape around it, Sheen. Tradition says that Edward the Confessor, delighting in the fair scenery, called it by that expansive Saxon word, signifying everything that is bright and beauteous. The king had, during this interval, attained his 22nd year, and his first question, on the meeting of his parliament, was, how old he was? And when they named the years he had attained, he declared that his ancestors were always considered of age much earlier, and that the meanest of his subjects were of age at 21. He therefore determined to shake off the fetters that controlled him. This scene was followed by a sort of recoronation at St. Stephen's Chapel, where the nobility renewed their oaths to him, and it was particularly observed that he kissed those with affection whom he considered as his adherents, and scowled at those who had been the leaders of the late insurrections. The king always appeared to have been exceedingly attached to his uncle, the Duke of Lancaster, but he had a strong wish to rid himself of his turbulent and popular cousin, Henry, the eldest son of that duke, who was born the same year as himself, and from infancy was his rival. On one occasion Henry had threatened the life of the king in the presence of the queen. "Thrice have I saved his life," exclaimed King Richard. "Once my dear uncle Lancaster, on whom God have mercy, would have slain him for his treason and villainy, and then, O God of paradise, all night did I ride to preserve him from death. Once also he drew his sword on me, in the chamber of Queen Anne." King Richard soon after bestowed on the Duke of Lancaster the sovereignty of Aquitaine, probably with the design of keeping the son of that prince at a distance from England. The queen held a grand festival on this occasion. Part of the high ceremonial consisted in the queen's presentation of the Duchess of Lancaster, with the gold circlet she was to wear as Duchess of Aquitaine, while Richard invested his uncle with the ducal coronet. But the investiture was useless, for the people of Aquitaine refused to be separated from the dominion of England. The king's full assumption of the royal authority was celebrated with a splendid tournament, over which Queen Anne presided as the sovereign lady to bestow the prize, a rich jewelled clasp, to the best tenant of the lists, and a rich crown of gold to the best of the opponents. 60 of her ladies, mounted on beautiful palfreys, each led a knight, by a silver chain, to the tilting ground at Smithfield, through the streets of London, by the sound of trumpets, attended by numerous minstrels. In this order they passed before Queen Anne, who was already arrived with her ladies, and placed in open chambers, richly decorated. The queen retired, at dusk, to the Bishop of London's palace at St. Paul's, where she held a grand banquet, with dancing both before and after supper. During the whole of the tournament, the queen lodged at the palace of the Bishop of London. The queen's good offices as a mediator were required in the year 1392, to compose a serious difference between Richard II. And the city of London. Richard had asked a loan of £1,000 from the citizens, which they peremptorily refused. An Italian merchant offered the king the sum required, upon which the citizens raised a tumult, and tore the unfortunate loan-lender to pieces. This outrage being followed by a riot, attended with bloodshed, Richard declared, that as the city did not keep his peace, he should resume her charters, and actually removed the courts of law to York. In distress, the city applied to Queen Anne to mediate for them. Fortunately, Richard had no other favorite at that time than his peace-loving queen, who was, says the ancient historians, very precious to the nation, being continually doing some good to the people, and she deserved a much larger dower than the sum settled on her, which only amounted to £4,500 per annum. The manner in which Queen Anne pacified Richard is preserved in a Latin chronicle poem, written by Richard Maydeston, an eyewitness of the scene. He was a priest attached to the court, and in favour with Richard and the queen. Through the private intercession of the queen, the king consented to pass through the city, on his way from Sheen to Westminster Palace, on the 29th of August. When they arrived at Southwark, the queen assumed her crown, which she wore during the whole procession through London. It was blazing with various gems of the choicest kinds. Her dress was likewise studded with precious stones, and she wore a rich carcanet about her neck. She appeared, according to the taste of Maydeston, fairest among the fair, and from the benign humility of her gracious countenance, the anxious citizens gathered hopes that she would succeed in pacifying the king. During the entry of the royal pair into the city, they rode at some distance from each other. At the first bridge tower, the king and queen were met by the lord mayor and other authorities, followed by a vast concourse of men, women, and children, every artificer bearing some symbol of his craft. Before the Southwark Bridge gate, the king was presented with a pair of fair white steeds, trapped with gold cloth, figured with red and white, and hung full of silver bells. Steeds such as Caesar might have been pleased to yoke to his car. Queen Anne then arrived with her train, when the Lord Mayor Venner presented her with a small white palfrey, exquisitely trained, for her own riding. The Lord Mayor commenced a long speech with these words: O generous offspring of imperial blood, whom God hath destined worthily to sway the sceptre as consort of our king. He then proceeds to hint that mercy and not rigor best become the queenly station, and that gentle ladies had great influence with their loving lords. Then entering into the merits of the palfrey, he commended its beauty, its docility, and the convenience of its ambling paces, and the magnificence of its purple housings. After the animal had been graciously accepted by the queen, she passed over the bridge and came to the bridge portal on the city side. But some of her maids of honor, who were following her in 2 wagons or charrettes, were not quite so fortunate in their progress over the bridge. Old London Bridge was, in the 14th century, and for some ages after, no such easy defile for a large influx of people to pass through. Though not then encroached upon by houses and shops, it was encumbered by fortifications and barricades, which guarded the drawbridge towers in the centre, and the bridge-gate towers at each end. In this instance the multitudes pouring out of the city, to get a view of the queen and her train, meeting the crowds following the royal procession, the throngs pressed on each other so tumultuously, that one of the charrettes containing the queen's ladies was overturned. Lady rolled upon lady, all being sadly discomposed in the upset. And, what was worse, nothing could restrain the laughter of the rude plebeian artificers. At last the equipage was righted, the discomfited damsels replaced, and their charrette resumed its place in the procession. But such a reverse of horn caps did not happen without serious inconveniences to the wearers, as Maydeston very minutely particularizes. As the king and queen passed through the city, the principal thoroughfares were hung with gold cloth and silver tissue, and tapestry of silk and gold. When they approached the conduit at Cheapside, red and white wine played from the spouts of a tower erected against it. The royal pair were served, with rosy wine smiling in golden cups, and an angel flew down in a cloud, and presented to the king, and then to the queen, rich gold circlets worth several £100. Another conduit of wine played at St. Paul's eastern gate, where was stationed a band of antique musical instruments, whose names alone will astound modern musical ears. There were persons playing on timpanis, monochords, cymbals, psalteries, and lyres, zambucas, citherns, situlas, horns, and viols. Our learned Latinist dwells with much unction on the symphonous chorus produced by these instruments, which, he says, wrapped all hearers in a kind of stupor. No wonder. At the monastery of St. Paul's, the king and queen alighted from their steeds, and passed through the cathedral on foot, in order to pay their offerings at the Holy Sepulchre of St. Erkenwald. At the western gate they remounted their horses, and proceeded to the Ludgate. There, just above the river bridge, which river, we beg to remind our readers, was that delicious stream, now called Fleet Ditch, was perched a celestial band of spirits, who saluted the royal personages, as they passed the Fleet Bridge, with enchanting singing and sweet psalmody, making withal a pleasant fume by swinging incense pots. They likewise scattered fragrant flowers on the king and queen as they severally passed the bridge. And if the odours of that civic stream, the Fleet at that time, by any means rivaled those which pertain to it at present, everyone must own that a fumigation was appointed there with great judgment. At the temple barrier, above the gate, was the representation of a desert, inhabited by all manner of animals, mixed with reptiles and monstrous worms, or, at least, by their resemblances. In the background was a forest. Amidst the concourse of beasts was seated the holy Baptist John, pointing his finger at an Agnus Dei. After the king had halted to view this scene, his attention was struck by the figure of St. John, for whom he had a peculiar devotion, when an angel descended from above the wilderness, bearing in his arms a splendid gift, which was a tablet studded with gems, fit for any altar, with the crucifixion embossed thereon. The king took it in his hand, and said, "Peace to this city. For the sake of Christ, his mother, and my patron St. John, I forgive every offense." Then the king continued his progress towards his palace, and the queen arrived opposite to the desert and St. John, when Lord Mayor Venner presented her with another tablet, likewise representing the crucifixion. He commenced his speech with these words: "Illustrious daughter of imperial parents, Anne, a name in Hebrew signifying grace, and which was borne by her who was the mother of Christ, Mindful of your race and name, intercede for us to the king, and as often as you see this tablet think of our city, and speak in our favor." Upon which the queen graciously accepted the dutiful offering of the city, saying, with the emphatic brevity of a good wife who knew her influence, "Leave all to me." By this time the king had arrived at his palace of Westminster, the great hall of which was ornamented with hangings more splendid than the pen can describe. Richard's throne was prepared upon the king's bench, which royal tribunal he ascended, sceptre in hand, and sat in great majesty, when the queen and the rest of the procession entered the hall. The queen was followed by her maiden train. When she approached the king, she knelt down at his feet, and so did all her ladies. The king hastened to raise her, asking, "What would Anna? Declare, and your request shall be granted." The queen's answer is perhaps a fair specimen of the way in which she obtained her empire over the weak but affectionate mind of Richard. More honeyed words than the following female blandishment could scarcely devise. "Sweet," she replied, "my king, my spouse, my light, my life. Sweet love, without whose life mine would be but death. Be pleased to govern your citizens as a gracious lord. Consider even today how munificent their treatment. What worship, what honor, what splendid public duty have they at great cost paid to thee, revered king? Like us, they are but mortal, and liable to frailty. Far from thy memory, my king, my sweet love, be their offences, and for their pardon I supplicate, kneeling thus lowly on the ground." Then, after some mention of Brutus and Arthur, ancient kings of Britain, which no doubt are interpolated flourishes of good master Maydeston, the queen concludes her supplication by requesting that the king would please to restore to these worthy and penitent plebeians their ancient charters and liberties. "Be satisfied, dearest wife," the king answered. "Loth should we be to deny thee any reasonable request of thine. Meantime ascend and sit beside me on my throne, while I speak a few words to my people." He seated the gentle queen beside him on the throne. The king then spoke, and all listened in silence, both high and low. He addressed the lord mayor. "I will restore to you my royal favour as in former days, for I duly prize the expense which you have incurred, the presents you have made me, and the prayers of the queen. Do you henceforth avoid offence to your sovereign, and disrespect to his nobles. Preserve the ancient faith, despise the new doctrines unknown to your fathers. Defend the Catholic Church, the whole Church, for there is no order of men in it that is not dedicated to the worship of God. Take back the key and sword. Keep my peace in your city. Rule its inhabitants as formerly, and be among them my representative." No further differences with the king disturbed the country during the life of Anne of Bohemia. It is probable that if the existence of this beloved queen had been spared, the calamities and crimes of Richard's future years would have been averted by her mild advice. Yet the king's extravagant generosity nothing could repress. The profusion of the royal household is severely commented upon by Walsingham and Knighton. Still, their strictures seem invidious. Nothing but partisan malice could blame such hospitality as the following in a time of famine. Though a terrible series of plagues and famine afflicted England, the king retrenched none of his diversions or expenses. He entertained every day 6,000 persons. Most of them were indigent poor. He valued himself on surpassing in magnificence all the sovereigns in Europe, as if he possessed an inexhaustible treasure. In his kitchen alone 300 persons were employed, and the queen had a like number to attend upon her service. While Richard was preparing for a campaign in Ireland, which country had revolted from his authority, his departure was delayed by a terrible bereavement. This was the loss of his beloved partner. It is supposed she died of the pestilence that was then raging throughout Europe, as her decease was heralded by an illness of but a few hours. Froissart says, speaking of the occurrences in England, June 1394, At this period the lady Anne, Queen of England, fell sick, to the infinite distress of King Richard and all her household. Her disorder increased so rapidly that she departed this life at the feast of Whitsuntide, 1394. The king and all who loved her were greatly afflicted at her death. King Richard was inconsolable for her loss, as they mutually loved each other, having been married young. This queen left no issue, for she never bore a child. Anne of Bohemia died at her favourite palace of Sheen. The king was with her when she expired. He had never given her a rival. She appears to have possessed his whole heart, which was rent by the most acute sorrow at the sudden loss of his faithful partner, who was, in fact, his only friend. In the frenzy of his grief, Richard imprecated the bitterest curses on the place of her death, and, unable to bear the sight of the place where he had passed his only happy hours with this beloved and virtuous queen, he ordered the palace of Sheen to be levelled with the ground. The deep tone of Richard's grief is apparent even in the summons sent by him to the English peers, requiring their attendance to do honour to the magnificent obsequies he had prepared for his lost consort. His letters on this occasion are in existence, and are addressed to each of his barons in this style. Very dear and faithful cousin, inasmuch as our beloved companion, the Queen, whom God has hence commanded, will be buried at Westminster on Monday, the 3rd of August next, we earnestly entreat that you, setting aside all excuses, will repair to our city of London, the Wednesday previous to the same day, bringing with you our very dear kinswoman, your consort, at the same time. We desire that you will, the preceding day, accompany the corpse of our dear consort from our manor of Sheen to Westminster, and for this we trust we may rely on you, as you desire our honour and that of our kingdom. Given under our privy seal at Westminster, the 10th day of June, 1394. We gather from this document that Anne's body was brought from Sheen in great procession, the Wednesday before the 3rd of August, attended by all the nobility of England, male and female, likewise by the citizens and authorities of London, all clothed in black, with black hoods, and on the 3rd of August the queen was interred. Abundance of wax was sent for from Flanders, for flambeaux and torches, and the illumination was so great that nothing was seen like it before, not even at the burial of the good Queen Philippa. The king would have it so, because she was the daughter of the Emperor of Rome and Germany. The most memorable and interesting circumstance at the burial of Anne of Bohemia is the fact that Thomas Arundel, afterwards Archbishop of Canterbury, who preached her funeral sermon, in the course of it, greatly commended the queen for reading the Holy Scriptures in the vulgar tongue. Richard's grief was as long enduring as it was acute. 1 year elapsed before he had devised the species of monument he thought worthy the memory of his beloved Anne, yet his expressions of tenderness regarding her pervaded his covenant with the London artificers employed to erect this tomb. He took, withal, the extraordinary step of having his own monumental statue made to repose by that of the queen, with the hands of the effigies clasped in each other. The tomb of Anne was commenced in 1395. The indentures descriptive of its form are to be found in the Foedera. The marble part of the monument was consigned to the care of Stephen Lote, citizen and mason of London, and Henry Yvel, his partner. In the document alluded to above occur these remarkable words: "And also inscriptions are to be graven upon the tomb, such as will be delivered proper for it." The actual inscription is in Latin. The sentiments are tender and elegant, and the words probably composed by the king himself, as it enters into the personal and mental qualifications of Anne, like one who knew and loved her. The Latin commences, "Sub petra lata mana, Anna jacet tumulata," etc. The following is a literal translation. "Under this stone lies Anna, here entombed, wedded in this world's life to the second Richard. To Christ were her meek virtues devoted, his poor she freely fed from her treasures. Strife she assuaged, and swelling feuds appeased. Beauteous in form, her face surpassing fair. On July 7th day, 1394, all comfort was bereft, for through irredeemable sickness she passed away into eternal joys. Richard departed for Ireland soon after the burial of Anne, but his heart was still bleeding for the loss of his queen, and though her want of progeny was one of the principal causes of the troubles of his reign, he mourned for her with the utmost constancy of affection. Frequently when he was in his council chamber at Dublin, if anything accidentally recalled her to his thoughts, he would burst into tears, rise, and suddenly leave the room. The year of her death, says Walsingham, was notable for splendid funerals. Constance, Duchess of Lancaster, a lady of great innocency of life, died then, and her daughter-in-law, the co-heiress of Hereford, wife of Henry of Bolingbroke, and mother of his children, died in the bloom of life. She was followed to the tomb by Isabel, Duchess of York, second daughter of Pedro the Cruel, a lady noted for her over-fineness and delicacy, yet at her death showing much penitence for her pestilent vanities. But the grief for all these deaths by no means equaled that of the king for his own queen Anne, whom he loved even to madness. The people of England likewise deeply regretted this benignant and peace-loving queen, and long hallowed her memory by the simple yet expressive appellation of Good Queen Anne. End of section 23. End of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 2, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland.